Phoebe Hogg, A Life in the Shadows. The Hampstead Case, Mary Pearcey, and the Price of Respectability. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. I did not meet Phoebe Hogg. I met her the way Victorian London met her, late, through other people's mouths. Through a neighbour's certainty. Through a constable's routine. Through a reporter's hungry shorthand. Through the hard-edged language of courtrooms where a woman becomes the deceased and a child becomes the infant, as if the right words could tidy grief into something that fits a column. In the autumn of 1890, North London was a place where respectability was a form of currency, and women paid for it daily, coin by coin, stitch by stitch, breath by swallowed breath. It was also a place built for watching. Curtains twitched. Footsteps were counted. Rumor moved faster than any carriage, and every story arrived already dressed in judgment. When Phoebe vanished, the city did what it always does. It assembled a narrative before it assembled the facts. It chose a villain with the speed of a crowd. It turned ordinary objects, keys, doorways, a stain that would not lift, a pram pushed through wet lamplight, into symbols. And then, as the headlines rose, Phoebe began to disappear a second time, not from the street, but from the telling. This book is not a defense brief, and it is not a spectacle. It is a reconstruction of a life and a death as the era allowed them to be seen, fractured, overheard, observed at angles. You will hear from people who are sure, and people who are wrong. You will hear from people who notice everything, and people who notice only what confirms what they already believe. In their voices, a city becomes a chorus. At the center of that chorus is a woman who wanted what so many women wanted and were promised they could keep: a home, a name that would protect her, a future that did not depend on anyone's temper or appetite. Whether history remembers her as a victim, a wife, a cautionary tale, or a line in a trial transcript, she was first a person, warm-bodied, exhausted, hopeful, afraid. If you have come looking for certainty, I can only offer you what the records and the witnesses offer, a trail of impressions, contradictions, and silences. But if you have come looking for truth in the way truth often exists, partial, bruised, and human, then step with me into the gaslit streets and the close rooms where everyone heard something, and no one heard enough. We begin where the city always begins, at a window half open, and a story already being told. Chapter 1. Phoebe. Phoebe counted the day by sounds before she counted it by light. The kettle first, its thin, impatient song rising from the hob as if it resented being asked to do the same work again. Then the house waking in pieces, a boot scraping on a stair above, a cough behind a wall, a door that never shut without a small, offended bang. The city beyond it all, steady as a pulse, wheels on stone, distant shouting, the low, constant scrape of London moving itself from one hunger to the next. She stood at the table with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, wrists damp, fingers red from wash water that never stayed warm long enough. Steam climbed off the basin and caught in her hair, loosening pins. She had meant to put it up properly before Frank woke, before the day began demanding things, but the baby had whimpered in that particular way that meant now, and then the fire had needed coaxing, and then, always, there was one more thing. A life was made of one more things. On the table, beside the bread tin, the rent book lay open like an accusation. Mrs. Wintle's pencil marks marched in neat little lines, each one a reminder that a roof was not a mercy but a transaction. Phoebe looked at it and looked away, as if not meeting its I might stop time from doing what time always did. She took the cloth, washed last night, ironed by pressing it under her forearms because there wasn't time for proper irons, and spread it over the table. She smoothed it with the flat of her palm. The small authority of that motion steadied her. A thing could be made orderly. A thing could be laid straight, even if life would not. In the cot by the grate, the baby slept with a fist tight beside his cheek, the skin creased like folded paper. His mouth opened, made a sound without waking, then closed again. The brief piece of it, his small body agreeing for once to rest, felt like something she ought to be grateful for, and that made her afraid. Gratitude was dangerous. Gratitude invited the world to take more. She turned to the fire again. The coals were dull, more memory than heat. She knelt and blew gently, coaxing, until the ember brightened. Her breath smelled faintly of yesterday's tea and her own tiredness. The kettle hissed, offended, and she took it off the hob before it could boil itself dry. She poured a little into the teapot and watched the leaves swirl as if they were trying to find a way out. The tea was weak, too much water, too few leaves, but weak tea still made a room feel civil. Tea was the last good habit of poverty. She set the pot down and listened. No footsteps yet. Frank would sleep as long as he could, as if he'd earned it by being a man with work in his hands. And perhaps he had. There were days his shoulders looked like they had carried more than furniture, like they had carried decisions, like they had carried the weight of being someone the world expected to provide and to lead and to never once ask for help. She told herself that when his temper cut quick. She told herself that when his silence turned the room cold. She told herself that because it was easier than admitting that sometimes, when he stood in the doorway, she felt the same instinct she felt when a dog growled, "Be still. Be careful." Phoebe wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window. The pane was smeared with last night's rain and coal dust. London never let glass stay honest. Across the street, a woman in a shawl bent over a doorstep, scrubbing with the fierce concentration of someone who believed cleanliness could protect her. A cart went by, slow and heavy, its wheels leaving dark tracks in the wet. A boy ran behind it and shouted a joke that made another boy laugh in the way boys did, sharp, careless, free. Phoebe felt, suddenly, as if she were watching life from behind more than glass. She should have been used to it. In the months since the baby's birth, her world had shrunk until it fit inside 2 rooms: the cot, the stove, the wash basin, the table. The street was something you stepped into the way you stepped into cold water, bracing, quick, never quite comfortable. Still, she pressed her fingertips lightly against the window frame, as if to anchor herself. A knock sounded below, 2 quick taps, then a pause, then another. The landlady's pattern. Phoebe's stomach tightened before her mind caught up. She set the teacup down carefully. It made a small clink against the saucer, too loud in the quiet. She opened the door to the landing, careful not to let it swing wide. The corridor smelled of other people, boiled cabbage, damp cloth, stale smoke. The smell of too many lives pressed together. Mrs. Wintle stood there in her wrapper with her hair pinned back and her lips set in the expression she wore for business, which was most expressions. She was a broad woman with hands that looked capable of anything, scrubbing, carrying, slapping sense into a man if the mood took her. Her eyes slid past Phoebe into the room. They always did. "Morning," Mrs. Wintle said, as if it were something you could own and sell. "Morning," Phoebe answered. She kept her hand on the door, her body in the gap, as if her body could protect the room from scrutiny. Mrs. Wintle's gaze landed on the table, the teapot, the cloth. For a second her face softened. Approval, perhaps, or envy. Then it hardened again into its proper shape. "Rent's due Friday," Mrs. Wintle said. "Don't leave it late, Mrs. Hogg." Phoebe did not correct her. She never corrected anyone. The name was a shield. It was also a lie she lived inside. "Yes," Phoebe said. "I know." "And the crying," Mrs. Wintle added, as if she hadn't come for that too. "It carries. People complain." "He's only a baby," Phoebe said, and heard the uselessness of it as she spoke. As if being a baby protected anyone from being inconvenient. Mrs. Wintle lifted her shoulders in a small shrug. "And you are only a woman." The building was full of things that were only. Only girls. Only wives. Only lodgers. Only mouths. "I'm not saying he can help it," Mrs. Wintle said, as if she were being generous. "I'm saying it carries." "Yes," Phoebe said again. Mrs. Wintle looked at her for one more heartbeat, perhaps weighing whether to say something kinder and deciding against it, then turned and went back down the stairs. Her slippers made no sound. Women learned not to make sound in hallways. Phoebe shut the door and leaned her forehead against it for a moment. The wood was cool. She breathed in and out until the tightness eased enough to let her move. From the bed, Frank shifted, an animal sound in his throat like a dog disturbed. Phoebe straightened quickly, as if posture could keep peace. He sat up, rubbing his face with both hands, then looked at her with the blankness of waking. For a moment he was just a man. Then his eyes focused and he became Frank again, Frank with the weight of his day, Frank with opinions, Frank with the right to be tired. "What's that?" he asked, voice rough. "The kettle," Phoebe said. "Tea's ready." Frank swung his legs out of bed and sat there a moment, shoulders hunched, as if he were gathering himself from sleep piece by piece. His shirt was unbuttoned, the skin at his collarbone pale. There were faint bruises on his knuckles. Work, or something else. In this city, you could never be sure. Phoebe poured tea into a chipped cup and handed it to him. Their fingers touched. Her skin flinched before her mind could decide whether it wanted to. Frank didn't notice, or pretended he didn't. He drank, then stared into the cup as if it might tell him something. "Any word?" he asked. Phoebe knew what he meant. She knew without having to ask, because it had been sitting in the room with them for weeks now, like a third person. A presence you didn't have to name for it to take up space. "No," she said. Frank's jaw tightened. "She's got a nerve." Phoebe kept her eyes on the tablecloth. She smoothed a corner that didn't need smoothing. "Maybe she's busy." Frank made a sound that might have been laughter if it had any warmth in it. "Busy. A woman like that's always busy when she wants to be." Phoebe's throat tightened. She hated the way Frank said a woman like that. Like Mary Pearcey was not a person, only a category, like dirt. She had never met Mary Pearcey. Not properly. Only in the edges of stories, whispers on stairs, the way women at the wash line lowered their voices and raised their eyebrows. That, Phoebe had learned, was how reputations were made. "Don't," she said softly. Frank's eyes flicked up. "Don't what?" "Talk," Phoebe said, and then because it came out wrong, she corrected herself. "Talk like that." Frank's mouth tightened. "You're taking her side now?" Phoebe felt a flash of panic. "No. I'm not. I just..." Frank stood abruptly, making the floorboard complain. He began pulling on his trousers. "She said she'd leave it," he muttered. "She said she'd leave it alone." Phoebe felt the words land in her chest as if they were physical. Leave it alone. As if it, whatever it was between them, whatever past Frank carried like a stain, was a thing you could set down and walk away from. "Frank," Phoebe said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant. "Please. Don't go there." He paused with his hands on his braces and looked at her sharply. "Go where?" Phoebe swallowed. She could see herself reflected dimly in the cracked looking glass on the mantel, a young woman with her hair coming loose, cheeks pale, eyes too careful. She looked like someone trying not to make a wrong move in a room full of knives. "To her," Phoebe said. "To Mrs. Pearcey." Frank's expression shifted. Annoyance, then something else, something like contempt, not for Mary but for Phoebe's fear. "You've got no call to tell me where I can go." "I'm not telling you," Phoebe said quickly. "I'm asking you." Frank turned away, yanking his shirt over his head. The cloth stretched across his back, showing the hard lines of muscle built by lifting other people's furniture. "She's the one won't let it be," he said. "She's the one keeps at it, writing and coming and making trouble." Trouble. As if trouble were a woman you could point to. Phoebe's fingers curled into her apron. She wanted to ask, "What did you promise her? What did you take?" But questions were dangerous. Questions made Frank's eyes go cold. "She might stop," Phoebe said, choosing the smallest possible hope. "If we don't answer. If we don't." "If we don't what?" Frank snapped, turning back. "If we don't exist?" The baby stirred at the sharpness in Frank's voice, making a small sound. Phoebe's heart leapt. She moved instinctively to the cot, but the baby settled again, sighing, his face puckering in sleep like a tiny old man. Frank saw it too. His face changed slightly, guilt or irritation, Phoebe couldn't tell. He had a way of feeling things and turning them into anger before they reached the surface. "She sent word yesterday," he said abruptly. Phoebe froze. "What word?" Frank's gaze held hers. Phoebe felt suddenly the sensation of stepping onto thin ice. "Said she wanted to see you." The room seemed to tilt, as if the floorboards had shifted. "Me?" Phoebe managed. Frank nodded, lips thin. "This afternoon." Phoebe's mouth went dry. "Why would she want to see me?" Frank shrugged, but his eyes were sharp with something that wasn't indifference. "To have her say. To make you look at her. He cut himself off, jaw tight. "She's got a way of putting herself where she's not wanted." Phoebe felt heat rise behind her eyes, sudden and humiliating. She blinked it back. Crying was dangerous too. It invited questions. It invited Mrs. Wintel's complaints to become judgments. "What did she say?" Phoebe asked, because she couldn't let it sit there like a thing in the room. Frank's gaze flicked away. She didn't say. Phoebe knew it was a lie. Not because she had proof, but because she had lived with Frank long enough to know how he looked when he was managing the truth. "Frank," she said quietly, "tell me." He exhaled hard, as if she were the problem, not the tangle he'd made. She said, he began, then stopped, then spoke quickly like someone tearing off a plaster. She said she wanted to see you and the baby. Said she had something to give. Said you'd be sorry if you didn't come. Phoebe's stomach turned. A gift. A threat. The two were often the same thing when you were a woman with little power. She looked at the rent book by the bread tin. She thought of Mrs. Wintle's eyes. She thought of the baby's future, how it would narrow if they missed payments, how quickly a landlord's patience became eviction. She thought of Frank's purpose when he put it on like a coat. "I don't want to," Phoebe whispered. Frank's mouth twisted. "You don't want a lot of things, Phoebe. But wanting doesn't keep the rent paid." It was unfair, and it was true enough to hurt. Phoebe stared at the rent book. The pencil marks marched on. In her head, she saw Mary Pearcey not as a person but as a rumor given shape, the woman people spoke of with a pursed mouth, the woman who lived alone and was called Mrs. without the blessing of a ring, the woman who had been before and would not stay in the past where Phoebe wanted her. "What does she want?" Phoebe asked again, softer now. Frank's eyes narrowed. "To make you miserable," he said. "To make you doubt me." Phoebe's fingers went numb. She wanted to say, "I already doubt." But she did not. She went to the basin and plunged her hands into the water as if cold could steady her. The water had gone grey with soap and ash. She watched it swirl around her wrists and thought of rivers, of drowning, of being pulled under by something you couldn't see. When she looked up, Frank was watching her. "You'll go," he said, not as a question. Phoebe met his gaze. In the cracked looking glass above the mantel, her face hovered like a ghost behind her own. She thought of the rent book. She thought of the baby's tiny fist. She thought of Mrs. Wintle's sigh that carried disapproval as easily as breath. She thought too, quietly, shamefully, of the relief of ending the tension, of letting the past stop knocking at their door. "All right," she said. The word fell into the room like a coin dropped into a box. Frank's shoulders eased, as if the decision had always belonged to him and was now properly settled. Phoebe dried her hands and began to dress the baby for the day, fastening tiny buttons with fingers that would not quite stop shaking. Outside the window, London brightened by a fraction, the clouds thinning just enough to make the wet street shine. The light looked clean from a distance. Up close, everything was still stained. And as Phoebe tied the baby's bonnet under his soft chin, she felt, without understanding why, a sudden impulse to memorize the feel of the ribbon between her fingers, tightening, knotting, securing, as if this ordinary act might be the last time she did it in peace. Chapter 2. The Neighbor. Mrs. Gleadle prided herself on knowing what was what. She did not like to be surprised. Surprise was for girls and gamblers and men who went to public houses with their wages still warm in their pockets. A decent woman survived by noticing, by seeing the small things early enough to name them, and naming them early enough to keep them from crossing her threshold. In a house like this one, thresholds mattered. The building breathed other people's lives through every crack: supper smells, damp wool, the sour tang of coal smoke and boiled water, the faint medicinal stink that clung to rooms where babies were born and old people died. You could tell who'd been arguing by the way a door closed. You could tell who was lying by how quiet they moved. You could tell a woman's luck by whether she scrubbed her step as if it might save her. Mrs. Gleadle sat with her sewing by the window because the light was better there and because you could see the street without seeming to watch it. There was an art to watching without being caught at it. Curtains were not only for privacy, they were for judgment. This was not idleness. This was management. If you knew what was happening, you could plan for it. You could decide which neighbor to trust with a borrowed cup of sugar and which one would return the cup with their fingerprints all over the inside. You could decide which stair you took when you were alone at night. You could decide when to turn your face away so no one could accuse you of seeing. Across the way, she could see the comings and goings as clearly as if she owned them. Men to work. Women to errands. Children like loose buttons, always darting. And then, now and then, something that didn't fit. Phoebe Hogg fit, mostly. Phoebe was young, but she held herself like she understood the rules. She kept her head down on the stairs, didn't loiter in the doorway. She carried her baby close, not flung out to the world. Her skirts were clean enough for a woman who didn't have help. Her hair was pinned with care, though it came loose by afternoon the way all women's hair came loose when their day was too long. Phoebe had that look, half apologetic, half determined, that meant she knew her place but wished, in private, it might shift. Mrs. Gleedle understood that look. She had worn it herself as a girl, back when she still believed life might make room for her if she tried hard enough. Now she knew better. Trying hard only made you tired. She watched Phoebe this morning moving about her room behind the glass, and felt something like approval rise in her chest. Kettle on early. Tablecloth laid. Baby quiet. The shape of decency, even if decency was only thin cotton over a poor table. Mrs. Gleedle liked a woman who tried. She liked it because it reassured her, see? It can be done. Then Frank Hogg rose, and the temperature of the scene changed. Men did that without knowing. They entered a room and the air rearranged itself around them. Frank Hogg wasn't a brute, Mrs. Gleedle told herself. She'd seen brutes. Brutes left marks you could count. Brutes shouted in the street and made you flinch when you heard their names. Frank was the other kind. He carried himself like a man who believed he was owed peace and could not understand why the world insisted on making him pay for it. He moved sharply, shoulders tight, and Phoebe's hands moved faster in answer, the way a woman's hands did when she was trying to keep a man from turning into a storm. Mrs. Gleedle clicked her tongue softly. Not loud enough to be heard. Just enough to satisfy herself that she'd noticed. She put her needle through cloth and tried to concentrate on the hem she was repairing. A decent woman did not stare out of windows like a cat. But her eyes kept going back. It was stronger than discipline. It was instinct. A building like this did not forgive a woman who failed to notice. At the far end of the street, a woman in dark clothing paused by a lamppost as if deciding which way to go. Mrs. Gleedle's needle stopped mid-stitch. You learned faces in this neighborhood the way you learned the pattern of your own wallpaper, by seeing them too often to pretend they weren't there. Mary Pearcey was not a face you forgot, not once you'd put her in your mind properly. Mrs. Gleedle had seen her only a handful of times, enough. Enough to know the angle of her chin, the directness in her gaze. Enough to know she didn't move like other women moved. Most women walked as if apologizing for taking up space. Mary Pearcey walked as if space belonged to her and anyone else in it ought to adjust. That was what made her dangerous, in people's minds. Mrs. Gleedle had heard the talk long before she'd put name to face. Mrs. Pearcey, people called her, with a certain twist to it that made the title an accusation. Mrs. without a husband. Mrs. without a ring. Mrs. by her own decision. There were women who lived alone out of necessity, widows, the abandoned, but Mary Pearcey lived alone like she preferred it. Preference was a kind of arrogance. Mrs. Gleedle watched her now, standing still while life moved around her. The woman's gaze lifted toward the lodging house windows, toward Phoebe's, toward the room with the baby and the tablecloth. A chill crawled along Mrs. Gleedle's forearms. She told herself she was imagining it. Lots of women looked up at windows. Lots of women paused by lampposts. Then Mary Pearcey turned her head slightly and looked directly at Mrs. Gleedle's window. Mrs. Gleedle did not flinch. She did not draw back. She held the needle steady and stared right back through the lace curtain. For a heartbeat they looked at one another, the woman who watched and the woman who did not mind being watched. Mary Pearcey's mouth curved, not quite a smile. A knowing. Then she turned and walked on, steady as a metronome, not hurrying even when a cart forced her closer to the curb. Mrs. Gleedle let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd taken. Well, she murmured to no one. Well. Behind her, her youngest clattered a spoon in a bowl. Mrs. Gleedle turned automatically. Her kitchen was narrow, her life was narrower. She had no room for strange women and their strange ways. What you staring at? Her daughter asked, mouth full. Eat, Mrs. Gleedle said, and her voice had the snap of habit. Then softer, mind your bowl. The girl rolled her eyes and reached for more bread. Mrs. Gleedle went back to the window. Phoebe had moved away from the light. Frank's shape filled the frame for a moment, then disappeared. A door shut. Not a slam. Not gentle either. A shut that meant, I'm finished with this conversation. Mrs. Gleedle's stomach tightened. She had lived long enough to know that a man's shut door was often the beginning of a woman's silence. At noon she went down to shake her mat on the step, because clean thresholds were important and because the street talk was always waiting. Mrs. Wintle was already there with her arms folded as if they were holding her together. "Afternoon," Mrs. Gleedle said, though it wasn't quite. Mrs. Wintle gave a tight nod. Her eyes were fixed on the opposite side of the street. Mrs. Gleedle followed her gaze and saw Mary Pearcey again, closer now, walking with purpose. Not strolling. Not wandering. Purpose. Phoebe's door opened. Phoebe stepped out, baby bundled against her, bonnet tied too tight under her chin. She hesitated at the top of the stairs like someone about to step into deep water. Mary Pearcey stopped at the bottom and looked up. Mrs. Gleedle felt a prickling at the base of her neck, the way you did when a storm was coming and your body knew before the sky admitted it. Phoebe began to descend. One hand on the banister, knuckles white. The baby made a small sound and settled. Mary Pearcey's face was calm. Too calm. Calm like a lid on boiling water. Mrs. Gleedle held her mat in both hands and forgot to shake it. "You see," Mrs. Wintle whispered, leaning slightly toward her, as if they were in church. Mrs. Gleedle didn't answer. She watched Phoebe reach the bottom step. She watched Mary Pearcey say something, too low to hear from here, and saw Phoebe's head tilt in response, a small movement of compliance. A woman could say yes with a tilt of her head. Mary Pearcey took a step back, clearing space as if inviting Phoebe to walk beside her. Like equals. Like friends. Phoebe did not look like a woman walking beside a friend. She looked like a woman walking beside a decision. They moved off together, Phoebe and her baby and Mary Pearcey beside her, and for a moment Mrs. Gleedle saw them as the street would see them. Two women, one with a child, one without, and nothing more. Then the moment passed, and the old story settled back into place. Mrs. Gleedle shook her mat hard. Dust rose and drifted in the light like ash. Mrs. Wintle sniffed. "Mark my words," she said, low and satisfied. "That one'll be the ruin of her." Mrs. Gleedle watched the three figures disappear into the crowd, swallowed by the day. She wanted to call out. Not to Phoebe, calling out would shame her. Shame was a weapon, and Mrs. Gleedle was not a cruel woman. But she wanted suddenly to tell someone. To fix it in words, to pin it down like a scrap of cloth so it couldn't move where it pleased. Instead she did what decent women did when the world offered them something ugly and uninvited. She went back inside. She closed her door. She sat down with her sewing again. And she listened, because in houses like these, you could always hear what came next. That was the worst part, not knowing, but expecting. Chapter 3. The Pawnbroker's Girl. Etta liked Mondays because the week hadn't had time to go sour yet. The shop opened on a street that never pretended to be anything but what it was, commerce and hunger laid out plain. The butcher's saw sang behind a door. The fishmonger's slabs glistened like wet stone. Men argued about pennies as if pennies were principle. Women carried parcels that were too light to be food and too heavy to be hope. Inside, the pawn shop smelled of brass polish, damp cloth, and the faint sweet rot of old velvet. The air held ghosts of perfume and sweat and lavender sachets that had once belonged to better days. Everything that entered the shop brought its own scent, rain-soaked wool, stale tobacco, cheap scent meant to hide cheaper gin. Etta stood behind the counter with her sleeves pinned up and her hair scraped back so tight it pulled at her temples. Mr. Kettleby liked things neat. Neat ledgers, neat tickets, neat girls. Neatness was its own kind of security. It made him believe the world could be kept in columns if you just wrote it down correctly. He did not believe in mercy. Mercy didn't balance. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle when customers came in. Most of them had the same eyes, quick, wary, already braced for refusal. Pawn shops were not kind places. They were honest places, which was worse. By midday, Etta had written out 8 tickets, tied 6 bundles, and watched one woman cry in silence while pretending not to. The woman's tears dropped onto the counter and dried in little dark spots. She apologized for them. Etta told her it was nothing, because that was what girls were trained to say when faced with a grown woman's grief. Etta had a talent for noticing what people tried to hide. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. A girl learned early that secrets moved through the city like soot, getting on everything whether you invited it or not. That day, she noticed the pair before they spoke. The bell jingled again. 2 women came in. At first glance they looked like any pair from the street, one young with a baby, one older and sharper. But the shop made liars of first glances. It flattened people into what they carried. The younger woman held the child close, its bonnet tipped slightly to one side. Her cheeks were pale, the skin around her mouth tight with the effort of keeping herself composed. She didn't look like someone used to asking for anything, which meant she'd been forced to recently. The other, dark-haired, chin lifted, walked as if the shop belonged to her. She wasn't dressed finely, but she wore her clothes with intention, and there was a kind of careless confidence about her, as if rules were made for other women. Etta felt, irrationally, that the air had shifted, as if the room had been rearranged by their presence. Mr. Kettleby glanced up from his ledger, took in the pair, and made the smallest possible narrowing of his eyes. That was his greeting. "What is it?" he asked. The confident woman smiled, and it wasn't friendly. "We've brought something to pledge." The younger woman flinched at the word pledge as if it were a slap. Her eyes flicked down to the baby and then to the floor, as if she wanted to hide inside her own shame. Mr. Kettleby's gaze slid to the baby, then to the bundle the confident woman placed on the counter. It was wrapped in cloth, tied with a string that had been knotted and reknotted, used string, the kind that came from parcels and got saved. Etta reached for it automatically, but Mr. Kettleby's hand moved first. He untied the string with practiced fingers and peeled back the cloth. Silver flashed in the gaslight, dull, not bright. A small piece, a brooch perhaps, with a floral engraving and a tiny dent like a tooth mark. Not expensive enough to impress. Sentimental enough to hurt. The mother's eyes fixed on it as if it were a part of her body that had been cut away. "Where'd you get it?" Mr. Kettleby asked, though it wasn't his business and everyone knew it. He asked because he liked to. Power tasted good in a man who did not have much of it. The confident woman didn't blink. "A gift," she said. The young mother swallowed. Her fingers tightened on the baby. "It was mine," she added, voice small. "From before." From before. Etta felt the phrase settle in her mind like a pebble in a shoe. Women always had a before. Men did too, but men's befores were called experience. Women's befores were called mistakes. Mr. Kettleby grunted, turning the piece over, inspecting the catch, the stamp. "It's not much." "It's enough," the confident woman said lightly, as if money were a thing you could summon by charm. Mr. Kettleby looked up. His eyes landed on the mother. "You need to sign," he said, and pushed the ledger toward her. The mother stared at the ledger as if it were written in a foreign language. Her cheeks colored with shame. Etta saw her lips part, saw the question forming, "How?" and saw her swallow it down. Asking for help was another kind of debt. "I can," Etta began, because she couldn't stop herself. Mr. Kettleby's glance cut her off. "Name," he said to the mother. "And address." The mother's fingers hovered over the pen. Her hand shook. It was a small tremor, but Etta saw it, the way you saw a candle flame tremble when a door opened. "Phoebe Hogg," she said. The name came out carefully. "Number," she hesitated, then gave an address in a voice that sounded like it had been scraped thin. Mr. Kettleby scribbled, unimpressed. "Mark," he said, and pushed the pen back. Phoebe looked at the page. Her jaw tightened. Then she made a small cross, precise as she could manage. It looked like a wound on the paper. The confident woman watched her do it with a look that might have been satisfaction, or might have been something else, possession perhaps. Etta couldn't tell, but she felt the hairs rise on her arms. Mr. Kettleby took the ticket Etta prepared and slid it across the counter. "2 shillings, he said. "That's all." Phoebe's face fell. 2 shillings was a week's bread if you were careful, a day's coal if you weren't lucky. It was not enough for the way her shoulders had been braced for it. The confident woman didn't even haggle. She took the coins and dropped them into her palm with a little clink, then closed her fingers around them as if the money belonged there. "Thank you," she said, and turned toward the door. Phoebe didn't move. Etta noticed then that Phoebe was looking at the ticket, not the coins, looking at the paper with a kind of desperate attention, as if she were trying to memorize it in case she lost even that. As if the ticket was the only proof that her before still existed somewhere, locked behind a counter. "You'll need that to get it back," Etta said softly, unable to help herself. Phoebe's eyes lifted. They were light, tired, and frightened in a way Etta recognized. Not fear of the shop. Fear of whatever waited outside it. "Yes," Phoebe whispered. The confident woman made a small impatient sound. "Come on," she said, not cruelly exactly, but with the tone you used with someone who belonged to you. Phoebe flinched again. She tucked the ticket into her glove like it was contraband and followed. As the door opened, the bell jingled, and cold air rushed in with street noise and the scent of damp wool. The two women stepped out into the moving world. Etta watched them go. The confident woman stepped first, leading. Phoebe trailed half a step behind, the baby pressed tight to her chest, her head turned slightly as if listening for footsteps that weren't there. When the door shut, the shop felt too quiet. Mr. Kettleby returned to his ledger as if nothing had happened. "Next," he called, and another customer shuffled forward with a bundle. Etta dipped her pen and tried to focus on the ink, on the neatness of columns, on the safety of numbers. But the image stayed with her, the young mother making a cross on the page, surrendering an object from before, and the other woman's smile like a latch clicking into place. Later, when the rush thinned and Mr. Kettleby went into the back room to count, Etta took the ledger and looked again at the mark beside Phoebe Hogg's name. A small cross. A woman's signature reduced to a symbol because words were not allowed to belong to her. Etta wondered what it felt like to be named by other people all your life. Outside, the street noise rose and fell. A cart rattled. A shout. A laugh. Etta thought of Phoebe's flinch when the confident woman spoke. She thought of the way the confident woman's hands had closed around the coins. She thought, with a cold certainty she couldn't quite explain, if you could make a woman sign, you could make her do almost anything. And if you could make her ashamed, you wouldn't even have to force her. She'd force herself. Chapter 4. Phoebe. Mary Pearcey walked as if she had nowhere to be late to. Phoebe had to shorten her steps to keep pace, the baby's weight pulling at her arms, the bundled cloth growing warmer against her chest. The afternoon was damp enough to make every hem heavy. London did that, made even walking feel like labor. The air tasted of soot and wet stone. It made Phoebe's throat feel lined with grit. They moved through streets that shifted without warning from respectable to ragged, a row of cleaner brick giving way to soot-streaked fronts, a butcher's window bright with pink flesh, a narrow lane where the smell of stale beer and horse waste clung low, as if it had learned to live there. Phoebe kept her eyes forward and her mouth shut, the way you did when you were out with someone whose reputation might stick to you. Mary spoke now and then, but not in full sentences. Little remarks, about the weather, about the price of coal, about a woman she'd seen with her bonnet tied wrong. Things that sounded ordinary until you noticed how they were chosen, like pins placed deliberately to hold fabric in a particular shape. Phoebe answered when she had to. Her voice felt like it belonged to someone else. She kept thinking of the bolt on Mary's door, the way Frank had said it offhand, as if mentioning the weather. She wants to see you. As if seeing was harmless. Seeing was never harmless. At the corner of a street lined with shops, Mary paused and pretended to look into a window. Phoebe stopped too, grateful for the pause, shifting the baby higher. He was sleeping, his mouth slightly open, a faint bubble at the corner of his lip. Phoebe wiped it with her thumb, an automatic tenderness that made her ache. "Lovely, isn't it?" Mary said. Phoebe blinked, following Mary's gaze to the window display. A row of baby clothes, tiny gowns, caps with lace, pale ribbons. They looked like something from another world, one where babies arrived already blessed and women didn't have to count coal. Phoebe didn't answer. Mary's eyes stayed on the display a moment longer than necessary, then slid to Phoebe. "He's a pretty one," she said softly. Phoebe's arms tightened. Compliments from strangers were never free. "He's well," she said, because saying a baby was well was safer than saying he was beautiful. Beautiful invited envy. Mary smiled faintly. "And you," she said, "look like you've not slept in a year." Phoebe's cheeks flushed. She hated being seen. Seeing meant being judged. "I manage," she said. Mary's smile deepened as if that phrase pleased her. "Women always do," she murmured, and there was something in her voice that sounded like admiration and resentment braided together. They walked again. Phoebe felt the city watching her, not just eyes from windows, but the invisible attention of people who knew her name now, who knew her as Frank's wife, as Mrs. Hogg, as the young mother who tried too hard. She could almost hear their thoughts. "There she goes with that one." Mary seemed to relish it. She held her chin up a fraction more, walking beside Phoebe like a declaration. At last Mary turned abruptly, leading them into a smaller street Phoebe didn't know well. The buildings stood closer together here, as if conferring. Washing lines sagged between windows. Children stared with the blunt, unashamed curiosity of creatures who hadn't yet learned to be polite. Phoebe felt the urge to turn back. But turning back would mean admitting she'd made a mistake. And women were punished for mistakes more than for danger. Mary stopped at a narrow door and produced a key from her pocket. The metal flashed in her hand like a secret. She opened the door without hesitation and stepped inside. Phoebe hovered on the threshold. "You're not coming in?" Mary asked, glancing back as if Phoebe were being foolish. Phoebe forced her feet forward. The baby made a soft noise, and she adjusted him instinctively, pressing her cheek briefly against the warm top of his bonnet. A tiny smell of milk and cloth rose up and made her throat tighten. Inside, the air was close. Not filthy. Mary's room was tidier than Phoebe expected, which unsettled her more than mess would have. There were signs of care: a swept hearth, a chair with a cloth thrown over the back, a small mirror polished to a dull shine. The neatness felt intentional. A stage set. Phoebe's mind catalogued it the way a woman's mind did: what could be used as a weapon, what could be used as an escape. The chair, the table, the fireplace tools, the bolt on the door. Mary shut the door behind them and slid the bolt with a soft, final click. Phoebe's stomach clenched. Mary turned, watching her. "You're nervous," she observed, and there was amusement in it, like she enjoyed seeing Phoebe's fear take shape. "I'm not," Phoebe lied. Mary's smile deepened at the lie. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair. Phoebe didn't sit. She shifted the baby higher in her arms, as if being upright might keep her safe. "What did you want?" she asked, trying to sound like a woman with rights. Mary tilted her head. "Straight to it." Then, almost gently, "You look tired." Phoebe said nothing. Being told you looked tired was a trap. If you agreed, you admitted weakness. If you denied it, you admitted pride. Either way, you gave something away. Mary moved to the small table and poured water into a glass as if she were the hostess of a better house. She offered it, holding it out. Phoebe stared at the glass. Her mouth was dry, but she didn't take it. The instinct to refuse was stronger than thirst. "You think I'll poison you?" Mary asked, and laughed softly. "Good God. Is that what they've told you I am?" "They," Phoebe repeated, and hated how small the word sounded. Mary took a sip herself, slow, deliberate. Then she set the glass down and leaned back against the table, arms folded loosely. She looked, Phoebe thought with a jolt, like a woman who was used to being listened to. "I wanted to see you," Mary said, "because you're the only person in this whole business who's done what she's supposed to." Phoebe frowned. "What do you mean?" Mary's eyes flicked to the baby. "You've married him," she said plainly. "You've made him respectable." Phoebe felt heat rise in her face. "Frank is respectable." Mary's laugh was quiet and sharp. "Men are respectable by existing. Women have to earn it. You know that." Phoebe's arms tightened around the baby until he gave a small protest and squirmed. She soothed him with a rocking motion she'd learned before she learned anything else. Mary watched, expression unreadable. "You've got a fine child," she said at last. Phoebe bristled. She stopped. She didn't want Mary to have even that word from her. Mary stepped closer. Not too close, she didn't touch, but enough that Phoebe felt her presence in her skin. She kept her voice low, intimate, as if they were conspirators. "I had a child once," Mary said. The words were dropped like a coin into water. Phoebe didn't know if they were true. She didn't know if they were meant to soften her or to pierce her. Either way, they landed with weight. Phoebe's throat tightened. She looked down at the baby, as if anchoring herself to the one fact she could trust: he is here. Mary continued as if she hadn't noticed Phoebe's uncertainty. "Do you know what it is to have something growing inside you and still feel alone?" Phoebe swallowed. She did know. She had never named it that way. Mary's gaze held hers. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Phoebe's heart beat hard enough that she could feel it in her palms. Then Mary's expression shifted again, and the softness, if it had been softness, was gone. "He told you I wrote," Mary said. Phoebe's lips parted. "He said you," she stopped. She wasn't sure what Frank had said. Only that he'd said it with anger, as if Mary's words on paper were an intrusion into his life. "He didn't tell you what I wrote," Mary said. It wasn't a question. Phoebe looked down at the baby again. She wished she could hide inside his sleep. Mary sighed, as if Phoebe were disappointing her. You really do let him manage the truth, don't you? Phoebe's temper flared, sudden and hot. It surprised her. Don't speak about my husband like that, she snapped. Mary's mouth twitched. Your husband. She said it as if she were tasting the word. Then, all right. Let's speak about you. Phoebe's pulse sped. What about me? Mary reached into a drawer and took out a folded paper. Her fingers were clean. Her nails were short. She held the paper as if it were fragile and important. This, she said, is what you've married into. Phoebe stared at the paper. Her hand lifted without her permission, then hovered. She didn't take it. Taking it would make it real. Mary didn't offer it closer. She let it sit between them like bait. You want me to read it, Phoebe said. Mary's eyes gleamed. I want you to know. There's a difference. Phoebe felt her throat constrict. Why? She whispered. Mary leaned in slightly. Because he's lied to you, she said, and her voice dropped, intimate as breath. And he'll go on lying as long as you let him. He lies the way other men breathe. Phoebe's mind flashed, unbidden, to moments she'd set aside because she couldn't afford to examine them. Frank coming home late with a story that didn't quite sit right. Frank's sudden gentleness after a sharp word. Frank's anger when she asked where he'd been. The way he could make her feel guilty for wanting simple explanations. She pushed the thoughts down. Hard. Mary watched her push them down. That was what made Phoebe hate her most, that Mary could see it. I've done nothing to you, Phoebe said, and her voice shook despite her effort. Mary's face hardened. Yes, she said, you have. Phoebe went still. Mary's hands tightened on the paper. You took him, she said, and now the anger was bare, unpolished. You took the name. You took the place. You took the life I was promised. Phoebe's mouth went dry. He wasn't promised, she managed. He's a man. Mary's laugh was ugly. Spoken like a wife. Phoebe's nails bit into her own palm. If you came to insult me. I came to warn you, Mary cut in, swift as a slap. Because he's the kind of man who will ruin you and then blame you for being ruined. Phoebe's eyes stung. Stop. Mary exhaled sharply through her nose, as if restraining herself. Then her expression smoothed. The rage folded away like a knife slipping back into a pocket. All right, she said lightly. Let's be sensible. Phoebe stared. Sensible. Mary nodded, as if they were discussing housekeeping. You're tired. He's difficult. The baby's expensive. You can't keep paying for his past. She tapped the folded paper. And you can't keep pretending I don't exist. Phoebe's voice came out raw. What do you want? Mary held Phoebe's gaze for a long beat. Long enough for Phoebe to hear her own breathing, to feel the baby's warmth, to feel the room closing. Then Mary said very softly, I want you to leave him. Phoebe felt as if the floor had dropped an inch. No. Mary's eyes narrowed. No. Phoebe's heart hammered. He's my husband. Mary's mouth curled. So you keep saying. Phoebe rocked the baby again, faster now, as if motion could keep the room from closing in. Mary stepped back and set the folded paper on the table. She smoothed it once, like a lover smoothing a sheet. I didn't say you had to do it today, she said. I'm not unreasonable. Phoebe's laugh came out as a breath. You're mad. Mary's gaze sharpened. Careful. Phoebe forced herself to breathe. The air tasted of soot and damp and something else, something metallic like fear. I'm going, Phoebe said, and the words came out before she could stop them. Mary didn't move. Are you? Phoebe's hand went to the bolt without thinking. Mary's voice followed her, calm and terrible. If you walk out now, she said, you'll go back to him and nothing will change. Phoebe's fingers closed around the metal. It was cold. Solid. Real. Mary took one step closer. Not touching, but near enough that Phoebe could smell her, soap and stale perfume and the faint bitterness of something medicinal. Tell me, Mary said softly. Has he ever looked at you like you were in the way? Phoebe froze. Mary's whisper curled around her ear. Has he ever made you feel like a burden for being a woman who needs? Phoebe's eyes blurred. She hated that Mary was right. She hated that Mary could name it. The baby stirred, fussing, and Phoebe's body answered before her mind did. She shifted him, soothed him, kissed his forehead. A small, fierce tenderness rose up in her like a flame. I won't leave him, Phoebe said, and her voice steadied. But I won't listen to you anymore either. Mary's expression, just for a second, showed something like surprise. Then it hardened again into contempt. Phoebe slid the bolt back and opened the door. Cold hallway air rushed in. It smelled like other people and escape. Phoebe stepped out, moving quickly, not looking back. Mary's voice followed her, soft as silk and sharp as wire. You'll remember this, she said, when it's too late to pretend you didn't. Phoebe did not answer. She couldn't. If she opened her mouth, she might scream. She went down the stairs with the baby pressed tight to her chest, her body trembling with the effort of not running. Outside, the street was full, women with baskets, boys with sticks, men with newspapers tucked under their arms. Ordinary life everywhere, indifferent and loud. Phoebe stood for one heartbeat on the pavement, blinking in the grey light, trying to convince herself she was safe because she was visible. Then she started walking. She did not know that the city had already begun to write its version of what had just happened. And in the city's version, she would be both innocent and guilty, guilty of being seen, guilty of being chosen, guilty of believing that a name could keep her safe. Chapter 5. The Constable. Constable Weller knew the sound of trouble the way a baker knew the sound of a loaf cooling, subtle, familiar, always arriving before anyone admitted it was there. His beat ran through streets that changed character every few steps. One corner had clean shopfronts and polite knockers, the next had alleys that smelled of piss and sour gin. London was not one city. It was a stack of cities pressed together, each one pretending it could not hear the other's breathing. Weller had been on the force long enough to understand what he was for. Not heroics. Not glory. Mostly he was for being seen. A uniform was a kind of promise people made to themselves. There's a line here. Even when the line was only cloth and buttons and a truncheon that seldom left its loop. He walked with his hands behind his back, steady, eyes moving without seeming to. You learned to read faces, who was drunk, who was hungry, who was simply lost. You learned to read women too, though they were harder, because women wore their fear like a second apron and called it politeness. It was late afternoon when he saw her. A young woman, bonnet tied, shoulders drawn in, carrying a baby wrapped close. She moved quickly but not running, which meant she was trying not to be noticed. That was a sign in itself. Most mothers wanted the street to make room for them. This one wanted the street to forget she existed. Weller slowed without thinking, keeping his pace ordinary. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she passed a shop window and caught her own reflection. For a second her mouth tightened, as if she'd seen something behind her. Then she looked away and kept walking. A few steps behind her, half a street length back, a second woman moved with the same direction but a different energy. Taller. Dark-haired. No baby. No basket. Nothing to justify her being out except her own intention. She did not hurry to catch up. She did not lag enough to seem unconnected. She kept a careful distance like a shadow that understood its job. Weller's instincts stirred. He'd seen men follow women before, drunks, brutes, opportunists. Men followed to take. Women followed women for different reasons, usually domestic ones. Domestic meant messy. Domestic meant everyone would deny it afterwards. He adjusted his course, crossing the road with the slow authority of the uniform. The street gave him a fraction of space. Not much, London never gave much, but enough. At the same time, a boy dashed between the two women, chasing a hoop, nearly colliding with the young mother. She jolted, clutching the baby tighter, her face flashing with fear so sharp it looked like pain. The baby let out a brief cry. The woman behind, dark-haired, paused and looked, not at the child, but at the young mother's face as if reading it. Then she smiled. It was not a smile Weller liked. It was too pleased. Too private. He turned fully toward them. The young mother seemed to sense the uniform before she saw it. She slowed, eyes flicking up to him with an expression that was half relief, half dread. Weller knew that look too. The look that said, "You might save me." And also, You might ruin me. He tipped his helmet slightly, as polite as the job allowed. Afternoon, ma'am. Afternoon, she answered quickly. Her voice was thin. Too quick. Everything all right? He asked, because that was what you said when your gut told you something wasn't. Her mouth opened. For a heartbeat it looked as though she might say yes and mean no, the way women did. Then she glanced, just a flick, to the side. To the dark-haired woman. Weller followed the glance. The other woman stepped forward now, closing the gap as if it had always been her right to be near. Up close, Weller could see she was not old, not truly, perhaps in her 20s, but she wore her face like someone who'd learned not to ask permission. Her eyes held his without flinching. The bonnet she wore was plain. The confidence beneath it was not. This is my friend, she said easily, before the mother could speak. She's had a fright, that's all. Boys flying about like sparrows. The mother nodded too quickly, the baby fussing again. Yes, she said. Yes, I'm fine. Weller watched her hands. They were tight on the bundle. Too tight. As if the baby was the only reason she was allowed to exist in public. Your friend, Weller repeated, letting his voice stay neutral while his eyes measured the space between the two women. The mother was half a step behind. The other woman had placed herself just ahead, naturally, like a shield or a captor. Weller's gaze went back to the mother. Name, he asked her, because even kindness in a uniform came with paperwork. The mother swallowed. Mrs. Hogg, she said. Weller noted it. Married. Respectable. Easier for the world to pity and easier for the world to blame. He turned to the dark-haired woman. And you? The woman smiled again, slight. Mrs. Pearcey. Mrs. A title worn like a challenge. Weller's eyes flicked, automatically, to her left hand. No ring. He waited, letting the silence stretch. People filled silence when they were nervous. Mrs. Pearcey did not. She held it as if she owned it. And where are you ladies headed? He asked. Mrs. Pearcey's gaze didn't waver. Home, she said. Mrs. Hogg's mouth opened and closed again. Weller caught the movement. Caught, too, the subtle shake in her breath. Home could mean safety. Home could mean a trap. Weller glanced around for another constable, a witness, a second uniform. The street was busy, but busy was not the same as safe. Men passed without seeing. Women passed without intervening. Everyone had their own life to protect. He looked back at Mrs. Hogg. You need any assistance, ma'am? He asked, careful, giving her a door she could choose to walk through. Mrs. Hogg's eyes flickered, hope, then fear, then a quick, miserable calculation. She shook her head. No, she said. No, thank you. Weller felt a cold frustration rise, irrational and familiar. He hated the way women said no when they meant yes. He hated, too, that he understood why. A woman who admitted trouble in the street invited trouble at home, trouble in court, trouble in a neighbor's mouth. A man could be saved by the police. A woman could be ruined by them. He shifted his gaze to Mrs. Pearcey. You know, ma'am, he said, there's been complaints lately. Women bothered. Followed. Mrs. Pearcey lifted her brows as if amused by the idea she might be bothered by anyone. Has there? She said lightly. Weller let his gaze drop briefly, to her hands. No basket. No gloves. Clean nails. A woman out with nothing in her hands meant she was out for a reason. Mrs. Hogg adjusted the baby again, the child's small face turning briefly toward Weller. The baby's eyes were closed. His mouth made a soft, sucking motion in sleep, as if dreaming of milk. For a moment Weller felt something tender and sharp in his chest. The baby didn't know any of this. The baby would be shaped by it anyway. Weller could press. He could ask where they were going, why, how long they'd been acquainted. He could make a scene that would make the street turn its head, and that would force the truth out simply because shame demanded a performance. But he'd seen what shame did to women. It did not protect them. It only made them easier to control. So instead he chose the small kindness that the job allowed. Mind the traffic, he said, stepping back. He met Mrs. Hogg's eyes once more, steady, brief. A message in it, if you need help, come to the uniform. Her eyes flickered with something like gratitude. Then the gratitude was buried again under her face. Mrs. Pearcey inclined her head as if dismissing him. Good day, constable, she said, and her tone made the words feel like a test he'd failed. They moved on. Weller watched them go until the press of people broke the line of sight. Then he resumed his beat, slower now, his thoughts not as orderly as he liked them. At the next corner he paused beside a costermonger's cart, pretending to inspect the street while he scanned faces. The man at the cart shouted prices. The smell of oranges rose in the damp air. Weller did not buy one. He told himself he'd done what he could. He told himself there was no crime in a woman walking with a baby and another woman following. But the unease didn't lift. It settled deeper, like damp in brick. Later, when the lamps were lit and the day turned thin and grey, Weller would remember the way Mrs. Hogg's eyes had darted toward Mrs. Pearcey before she answered. The way her friend had spoken for her without looking at her first. And he would think, with a bitterness that would make his mouth taste of metal. That was the moment. Not the moment of violence, not the moment of discovery. The moment when a woman stood beside a uniform and still could not say, out loud, I am afraid. He kept walking. London kept walking with him. And somewhere ahead, beyond his beat, a door would close with a sound that did not carry far, because in a city like this, the loudest things often happen behind walls. Chapter 6. The neighbor, again. Mrs. Gleadle heard the first sound at 6:30, just as she was setting her pot to boil. It wasn't a scream. That would have been simple. A scream demanded action. A scream gave you permission. This was a noise you could pretend was something else. A dull thump, like a chair knocked over, then a sharper sound like crockery meeting floor, then the quick scuffle of feet, not running but stumbling, a body trying to keep its balance and failing. Mrs. Gleadle's hand froze on the kettle handle. In a building like theirs, you learned which walls lied and which ones told the truth. Sound traveled oddly, through pipes, along floorboards, up the stairwell like breath. Sometimes you heard laughter that wasn't yours. Sometimes you heard crying you pretended belonged to someone else. This, Mrs. Gleadle knew, belonged to someone. She stood very still, listening. Another thump. A muffled cry, brief, strangled, cut off as if a hand had learned where to press. Mrs. Gleadle's heart began to beat hard enough that she felt it in her wrists. She looked at her daughter at the table, at the child's mouth moving around bread, the easy innocence of it. Go in, Mrs. Gleadle said. Her daughter blinked. What for? Because I said, Mrs. Gleadle snapped, sharper than she meant. Go. The girl's eyes widened. She slid off the chair and went, sulking, toward the back room. Mrs. Gleadle didn't follow. She couldn't. She had become a kind of animal, alert, rigid, waiting. The noises came again, fainter now, as if whatever was happening had shifted further from the shared wall. Or further into the middle of a room where sound didn't escape as easily. Then, silence. Not the ordinary silence of a paused conversation. A held silence. A managed one. The kettle began to hiss, offended, and Mrs. Gleadle realized she was gripping it too tightly. She set it down without pouring. Her palms were damp. She told herself it was nothing. A quarrel. A dropped pot. A child falling. But her mind kept returning to the image of Phoebe Hogg earlier, bonnet tight, baby bundled, walking beside Mary Pearcey like a woman being led. Mary Pearcey lived not far. Different building, different street, but close enough in the way women's lives were close in a neighborhood like this. Close enough for trouble to cross over without needing an invitation. Mrs. Gleadle went to her door. She put her hand on the latch. Then she stopped. If she opened it, she would be part of it. Part of it meant questions. Part of it meant men. Policemen. Courts. It meant standing in a room and having strangers stare at your face as if they could see your soul by looking hard enough. Part of it meant being called a gossip. Or worse, being called a liar. Mrs. Gleadle's hand fell from the latch. She returned to her table. She picked up her spoon. She forced herself to stir the pot as if stirring could make the world normal again. The stew smelled of onions and thin meat. Ordinary. Reassuring. She told herself, if it were truly bad, someone would shout. But no one shouted. After a time, she couldn't have said how long, fear did strange things to minutes, she heard footsteps on the stair outside. Light ones. Quick. Then the sound of the front door below opening and closing. Mrs. Gleadle's spoon paused mid-stir. She moved back to the window, careful, so she wouldn't be seen. She parted the curtain by a finger's width. The street was grayer now, the late day turning to early evening. Gas lamps along the road were being lit one by one, little pockets of yellow in the damp. A woman came into view. Not Phoebe. Not Mary Pearcey. A different woman, bonnet pulled low, face indistinct in the half-light, pushing a pram. Mrs. Gleedle's mind tried to make it ordinary. Women pushed prams. Babies needed air. Errands needed doing. But the pram was moving too quickly, wheels rattling. And the woman's posture was wrong, tense, leaned forward as if she were hauling a load rather than guiding a child. Then, as she passed beneath a lamp, the light struck her face. Mrs. Gleedle's breath caught. Mary Pearcey. Mrs. Gleedle knew it the way you knew a bad smell in milk. The set of the mouth. The shape of the cheekbones. The directness in her gaze even when she did not look up. Mary Pearcey pushed the pram with both hands, knuckles pale. She didn't look left or right. She didn't glance at windows. She moved as though the street itself were an obstacle she had to get through before it noticed her. Mrs. Gleedle's fingers tightened on the curtain. Where was Phoebe? Where was the baby? The pram hood was raised, casting the inside in shadow. It might have held a child. It might have held anything. Mary Pearcey turned a corner and was gone. Mrs. Gleedle stepped back from the window, her legs suddenly weak. Her mind was racing to catch up with what her eyes had already accepted. A woman. A pram. Evening. A sound that wasn't a scream. Silence after. She went to the door again. Her hand rose to the latch again. This time she opened it. The stairwell smelled of damp wood and boiled cabbage and someone's cheap perfume. It was quiet. Too quiet, like the building was holding its breath. Mrs. Gleedle descended one flight, then another, her slippers making small soft sounds. She told herself she was only going to check. Only to see if anyone needed help. Only. At the bottom landing she paused. Mrs. Wintle's door was closed. Phoebe's door across the way was closed too. No voices, no crying, no footsteps. Nothing. Mrs. Gleedle felt foolish. She felt relieved. She felt angry at herself for feeling either. Then she saw it. A dark smear on the stair rail where hands usually polished the wood smooth. Fresh. Not dust. Not soot. Too dark. Mrs. Gleedle's stomach turned. She leaned closer, not touching, only looking. In the dim light it could have been anything, grease from a roast, spilled tea, the city's grime. But her mind, once started, would not stop. She backed away, clutching the banister as if it might steady her. Her hand brushed the rail and came away damp. She looked at her fingers. Red-brown. Mrs. Gleedle's throat closed. She wiped her hand quickly on her apron as if the cloth could erase what she'd seen. As if she could undo being the sort of person who knew. Upstairs, her daughter called, "Mum." Mrs. Gleedle did not answer. She couldn't. If she spoke, she might give the truth a shape. She stood in the stairwell, listening to the building's silence, and felt something shift inside her, a recognition that she had crossed a line. You could close your door. You could draw your curtains. You could tell yourself you were not involved. But some things seeped through wood and brick all the same. Mrs. Gleedle went back up the stairs on legs that didn't feel like hers. In her room she washed her hands until they stung. She scrubbed under her nails. She poured boiling water over the rag. The water turned faintly pink, then clear again. She watched it swirl away down the drain, and thought, with a panic that felt like prayer, "Please let it be nothing. Please let it be nothing." Outside, the gas lamps burned steadier. London's evening settled in. Somewhere, a door shut. Somewhere else, a cart rattled by, ordinary as always. And in the ordinary noise, Mrs. Gleedle heard the thin, terrible truth. No one had screamed. Which meant, perhaps, no one had been allowed to. Chapter 7. The Omnibus Conductor. Albert Haynes never remembered faces, he remembered weight. The weight of bodies climbing up, the weight of coin dropped into his palm, the weight of the day pressing on a man's back until even standing upright felt like pride. An omnibus conductor lived by motion. Stop, start, stop. The street was a tide and you learned to keep your footing in it. That evening the air was wet enough to make every sound sharper. Hooves clicked cleanly. Wheels hissed over slick stone. Gaslight blurred into halos on the windows, making the faces inside look pale and theatrical. The damp got into everything: cuffs, collars, lungs. It made men swear and women hurry. Albert stood on the step, one hand on the rail, calling the next stop out of habit more than necessity. His cap sat low. His breath steamed in the lamplight. He had been on this route long enough to know where the road bucked and where the rich folks' lamps burned brighter. Camden Town. Camden Town, he called, and his voice came out rough from repetition. People came and went. A clerk with ink on his cuff. 2 girls with tight laughter and cheap ribbon. A woman carrying a basket that smelled faintly of fish. London, in its usual pieces, constantly rearranged. Albert took fares and made change quickly, fingers numb from cold. He watched the street the way a sailor watched water, always scanning, always braced. Trouble cost time. Time cost coin. Coin cost meals. Near the heath, when the road opened and the dark began to gather itself more confidently, he saw the pram. At first it was only a shape, a hooded bulk moving under the lamps. Then it resolved, a perambulator old but decent enough, pushed hard, its wheels skittering slightly on the wet. The hood was up, making the pram look like it was protecting something precious. The woman behind it was alone. That in itself was not unheard of, but it wasn't common, not at that hour and not with that sort of purpose. Women usually walked with other women, or at least with the company of a street that still felt safe. This woman moved as if she was trying to outrun the street's attention. Albert leaned forward slightly, squinting through the misted air. The woman's bonnet was pulled low. Her shoulders were tense. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, not glancing at shop windows, not pausing like shoppers did. She did not have the slackness of leisure in her body. She was not strolling. She was transporting. The omnibus rolled closer and as it did, the lamps caught the side of the pram. Albert's gaze snagged on something that didn't belong in ordinary errands. A dark stain. Not mud. Not rainwater. Too dark, too thick, spread unevenly along the pram's side like a handprint dragged. The stain looked as if someone had tried to wipe it and failed. Albert's stomach tightened. He told himself it was paint. It was a spill. It was the city's dirt. But his eyes had already decided, in that silent, primitive way eyes sometimes did. He glanced up at the woman's hands on the handle. They were bare. Her knuckles were strangely pale against the black grip, the skin stretched tight as if she'd been clenching for some time. She pushed as if she hated the weight of it. Albert felt the familiar itch of curiosity, that conductor's instinct to catalogue oddities to tell later in the depot, to make the men laugh, to make the night seem less long. Yet the itch did not feel like humor. The omnibus drew almost level with her. For a second, she turned her head slightly, just enough that Albert saw her profile under the bonnet. A young face, but hard around the mouth. Eyes bright and flat. Not drunk. Not lost. Albert couldn't have named her then, not properly, but the street had given him enough glimpses of certain types to recognize the outline, a woman who moved like she'd learned to fight for her place. The pram jolted over a rut and the hood shifted slightly, just a fraction, enough for Albert to glimpse the inside. He expected a baby's face. A tiny fist. The soft shape of blankets. What he saw instead made his breath catch. Cloth. A bundle. Something heavy beneath it that did not move. No rise and fall. No soft, restless shifting. Just wait. The hood dropped back into place as the pram's wheels straightened. The woman did not stop. Albert's mouth opened. He did not speak. He told himself, it might be laundry. It might be goods. It might be. But his mind offered the answer it did not want to hold. A body. A man behind him, one of the passengers, thick-coated, cheeks red with drink or cold, leaned out a little. What's she doing? He asked, amused, the way men were amused by women's labor until it became inconvenient. Albert forced his voice to come out steady. Mind your business, he snapped, sharper than he meant. The passenger drew back, offended, muttering something about insolence. Albert's heart pounded. He looked for a constable. There were always constables, weren't there? A uniform at the corner, a helmet bobbing in the crowd. Something official you could hand responsibility to like a parcel. But the street was thin here. Mist swallowed detail. The nearest figures were just shapes, heads down against the damp. The woman pushed the pram toward the darker stretch where the heath rose up like a shadow against the sky. The trees there looked like black lace against the remaining light. Albert's courage and caution wrestled inside him. If he said nothing and it was nothing, he would have saved himself embarrassment. If he said nothing and it was something, he would carry it the rest of his life. His feet moved before his mind could decide. He jumped down from the step when the omnibus slowed at the next stop, boots hitting wet stone with a slap. "Hold," he called to the driver, waving a hand. "Just a moment." The driver swore. "We're late already, Haynes." "Just a moment," Albert repeated, and heard the strain in his own voice. The driver pulled up with a reluctant jerk. Albert started after the pram. He did not run. Running would have made it real. Running would have turned his suspicion into an accusation, and accusations were dangerous things. A man could ruin a woman with one. A woman could ruin a man back, sometimes. Either way, it would become a scene. He walked quickly, keeping to the edge of the pavement, eyes fixed on the pram's hood. The woman didn't look back. If she heard him, she gave no sign. She turned onto a narrower path where the lamps were farther apart and the darkness pooled between them. The omnibus's lamps behind him threw long, warped shadows. The pram's wheels made a soft crunching sound over grit. Albert's mouth tasted of iron. He was close enough now to smell damp cloth and something else, something animal, coppery, wrong. The smell made his stomach flip. "Ma'am," he called, and his voice sounded foolish against the open dark. "Ma'am, are you?" The woman stopped so abruptly the pram rocked. Albert halted too, a few steps behind, suddenly aware that he was alone with her in a stretch of street that offered no witnesses. Even the noise of the city felt distant, muffled by trees and mist. She turned. Her face was pale in the lampglow, eyes bright and flat. She did not look frightened. She looked irritated, like a person interrupted mid-task. "What?" she said. Albert's throat tightened. He glanced at the pram, then back at her. "Is they," he began, and couldn't finish. He couldn't say baby. He couldn't say body. Words made things true. The woman's gaze flicked to where his eyes had gone and returned to his face. A small smile touched her mouth. "It's my sister's," she said lightly. "The pram. I'm taking it back." Albert frowned. "And the child?" The woman's smile deepened. "Sleeping." Albert stared at the hood. No sound came from it. Not a cough, not a breathy baby sigh. Only the faint creak of wet leather and the far-off hiss of wheels somewhere else. His skin tightened. "You shouldn't be out this late," he said, hearing the weakness in his own voice. "Not alone." The woman's eyes narrowed, a quick flash of anger. "Are you the police?" Albert swallowed. "No." "Then," she said, and the word was soft but sharp, "go on." For a moment Albert didn't move. The street seemed to hold its breath with him. He thought of his mother, how she told him women could be as dangerous as men if they had nothing left to lose. He'd laughed then. He wasn't laughing now. A constable's whistle sounded somewhere distant, thin and far away, like a bird. Albert's courage faltered. He stepped back. The woman turned the pram as if it weighed nothing and began to push again, moving off into the dimness without hurry now, as if she'd proved she could not be stopped. Albert watched her go until the mist swallowed her. Then he stood alone on the wet pavement, hands shaking slightly, his mind running in circles around the same thought. "I saw something. I did nothing." He returned to the omnibus with his skin tight, as if it no longer fit him. He climbed back onto the step. The driver stared at him, eyes narrowed. "What in God's name was that about?" the driver demanded. Albert opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "Because it was easier and because men were trained to protect themselves first." "Nothing." The driver spat to the side and clicked his tongue at the horses. The omnibus lurched forward, the wheels hissing over wet stone. Albert took fares with a hand that felt numb. He called stops with a voice that didn't sound like his own. He watched every pram on every street for the rest of the night, his eyes searching for a stain, a hood too still, a woman pushing too hard. And when he finally lay down in his bed hours later, the city quiet at last, he realized the worst part was not the fear. It was the certainty that by morning, London would have its story. And he would be one of the many men who could say, truthfully and uselessly, "I saw her." Chapter 8. Phoebe, Last Light. Phoebe woke from a short, broken sleep with the baby's breath warm against her collarbone and the taste of fear still in her mouth. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The room was dim, the air thick, the sounds outside muffled as if the world had been wrapped in cloth. Then she remembered. Home. Their room. The same 2 windows. The same cracked mirror. The same future waiting like a bill. The baby stirred, making a small dissatisfied sound, and Phoebe shifted him, rocking gently until his body softened again. His weight was familiar now, part of her, as natural as her own limbs. She kissed the top of his bonnet and inhaled the faint sour sweetness of milk and wool. If she held him close enough, she thought, nothing could reach them. That was the lie mothers told themselves. That was the only way to get through a day. Frank wasn't there. The bed was rumpled but empty. His boots were gone. The room felt both lighter and lonelier for it. Phoebe sat up slowly, careful not to jostle the baby awake. Her body ached in a dozen small places, shoulders from carrying, wrists from washing, hips from standing too long. The ache was ordinary. It was proof she was still in the world. She went to the small stove and coaxed the fire back to life with a bit of coal she'd been saving. The flame caught, reluctant, then steadied. She warmed water, washed her face, and smoothed her hair with damp fingers, pinning it up again because women were expected to look as if they were coping. In the cracked mirror above the mantel, she caught her own eyes. They looked older than yesterday. She turned away. From the street below came the call of a hawker and the clatter of a cart. A child laughed. Somewhere a dog barked once and stopped. London, indifferent, continuing. Phoebe made tea even though the leaves were weak. She laid the cloth on the table again because the act of laying it calmed her. She counted out coins and discovered, as she'd known she would, that there were fewer than she needed. Always fewer. The rent book stared at her from beside the bread tin. She touched it with her fingertips as if it were hot. The baby began to wake, fussing. Phoebe unfastened her blouse and brought him to her breast, turning her body slightly away from the window out of instinctive modesty even though no one could see. The baby latched, small mouth tugging, and a wave of tenderness so sharp it hurt rose up in her. "Please," she whispered, not sure who she was speaking to. "Please let me keep you safe." The baby fed, eyelids fluttering, and for a few minutes the world narrowed to this: warmth, breath, the steady pull that meant life. When he finished, he fell asleep again almost at once, milk-drunk and heavy. Phoebe wrapped him in his blanket and held him a little longer than necessary, just to feel the weight of him. Then she laid him down carefully in the cot by the grate. He sighed and settled. Phoebe stood above him, watching his tiny chest rise and fall. She wanted to memorize it, as if memory could prevent loss. Behind her, the door latch lifted. Phoebe's spine tightened before she even turned. Frank came in with the cold on him, bringing damp air and the smell of the street. His face was flushed from walking fast or from anger, she couldn't tell. He shut the door harder than he needed to. "You've been asleep," he said, accusing. "I wasn't," Phoebe lied. "Only a little. He kept me up." Frank's gaze went to the cot, then away. He didn't soften. He never softened for the baby unless it was convenient. "Where were you?" Phoebe asked, and immediately regretted it. Frank's eyes snapped to hers. "Out." Phoebe swallowed. "Frank." "Don't start," he said. Phoebe pressed her palms to the table edge, grounding herself. "I went," she said, forcing the words out. "Like you said. I went to see her." Frank's face changed. "And?" Phoebe felt the memory of Mary's room come back with a rush, the bolt sliding, the paper held out like a weapon, the soft voice asking the questions Phoebe didn't want to answer. "She wanted me to leave you," Phoebe said simply. Frank stared at her. For a heartbeat, his expression was blank. Then something flared behind his eyes, fear perhaps or rage or both. "That's what she said?" he asked, voice low. "Yes." "And what did you say?" Phoebe's throat tightened. She could feel the danger in the room like a change in weather. "I said no." Frank's shoulders eased a fraction. Relief. Then, immediately, suspicion. Just like that. Phoebe's fingers curled into the cloth. "What do you mean?" Frank took a step closer. "She said it to your face, and you just said no." His eyes narrowed. "What else did she say?" Phoebe hesitated. That was enough. Frank's mouth twisted. "Ah," he said softly, and the word was full of contempt. There's more. Phoebe felt heat rise in her cheeks. She showed me a paper, she admitted. Something she said was true about you. Frank's gaze sharpened. What paper? I didn't read it, Phoebe said quickly. I didn't take it. Frank stared at her, then laughed once, sharp and humorless. You didn't read it, he repeated, as if the idea was absurd. And you expect me to believe that? I swear, Phoebe said, and she heard the pleading in her own voice. She hated it. Frank turned away, pacing a small line in the room like a man trying not to explode. She's trying to poison you against me, he muttered. She's trying to get her claws in. Phoebe began, then stopped, because arguing with Frank was like throwing water on grease. Frank swung back toward her. Did she touch you? Phoebe blinked. No. Did she touch the child? No, Phoebe said more firmly. No, she didn't. She only talked. Frank's jaw worked. I'll put a stop to it, he said. Phoebe's blood ran cold. No. Frank's eyes snapped up. No. Phoebe stepped closer, lowering her voice automatically as if the walls might hear. Frank, please. Please don't go there. He stared at her as if she'd betrayed him. She's harassing my wife. Phoebe swallowed. She's mad, she said, choosing the simplest word. But if you go to her, you'll make it worse. Frank's face tightened. You don't know what she's capable of. Phoebe thought, with a jolt, neither do you. But she didn't say it. Instead she said, think of the baby. Frank's eyes flicked to the cot. For a moment his expression wavered. Then it hardened again. That's exactly why, he said. I'm not having her near him. Phoebe felt a sudden, fierce panic. She moved between Frank and the door without realizing she was doing it. Frank looked at her, slow. Get out of my way. Phoebe's hands shook. If you go, she whispered, you won't come back the same. Frank's nostrils flared. Don't talk like that. Phoebe's eyes stung. She tried to hold back tears, because tears were the one thing Frank despised. Tears made him feel accused. I'm scared, she said, and the admission tasted like metal. Frank stared at her for a long beat. Then he did something Phoebe didn't expect. He reached out and took her shoulders, not gently but not cruelly either, and shook her once, small, controlled, as if he were trying to shake sense into her. Listen, he said. She's nothing. Do you understand? Nothing. She's got no right. Phoebe's breath caught. His hands on her shoulders felt like a claim. I'm going to end it, Frank said. Tonight. Phoebe's vision blurred. Frank. Enough, he snapped, releasing her as if she'd burned him. I'm not arguing. He went to the bed and pulled on his coat. Phoebe turned toward the cot instinctively. The baby slept on, unaware. Phoebe's chest tightened with love and terror. Frank jammed his arms into his sleeves. If she comes here again, he said, you don't open the door. You hear me? Phoebe nodded because nodding was the only thing she could do. Frank opened the door. Phoebe stepped forward, grabbing his sleeve. Please, she said again, and now the tears were in her voice whether she wanted them or not. Please don't. Frank looked down at her hand on his coat as if it were an insect. Then he lifted his gaze to her face. Something in his expression softened, just a fraction. The old Frank, the one she'd once believed in. I'll be back, he said. And then he pulled free and left. The door shut. Phoebe stood in the silence after, her hand still raised as if she could reach through wood. Outside, the day had begun to dim. The sky pressed down, low and grey. The first gas lamps flickered into life. Phoebe went to the window. She told herself she could see Frank in the crowd if she watched hard enough, that she could somehow keep him safe by keeping him in sight. But the street was thick with bodies and shadow, and Frank was already swallowed by it. She looked at the baby again. His fist was curled beside his cheek, small and perfect. Phoebe's throat tightened with a sudden sick certainty she could not name. She moved to the door, then stopped. What could she do? Run after Frank? Leave the baby? Take the baby and follow, a woman with a child chasing a husband into the evening like a beggar chasing a lost coin. She stood still, paralyzed by the shape of her life. That was how the city kept women where it wanted them, not with chains, but with choices that weren't choices at all. Phoebe returned to the cot and sat beside it, watching her child sleep as the light drained from the room. She waited. And the waiting felt like the longest thing she had ever done. Chapter 9. The Landlady. Mrs. Wintle had been a landlady long enough to know that trouble rarely arrived with a flourish. It arrived like damp, quietly in corners, seeping in where you didn't notice until the wallpaper bubbled and the wood softened and suddenly the whole house smelled wrong. You could scrub and still the stain would show through. That was what trouble did. It made a home confess. She stood in her kitchen with her hands in flour, rolling out dough for a pie that would stretch the week. The room was warm from the oven, the only warmth she had the power to make. Her husband had been dead 5 years, which meant the house was hers and also meant the house was her burden. Tenants paid, tenants complained, tenants brought strangers to her door and called it none of her business. It was always her business, because it was her stairs they trampled and her walls they marked. The pie crust resisted under her rolling pin. The flour dusted her wrists and stuck in the creases of her skin. She liked the feeling. It meant she was making something solid, something that would turn into food. Food was reliable. Food did not argue. Upstairs, the building was quieter than usual. Quiet could be a relief. Quiet could also be a warning. Mrs. Wintle wiped her hands on her apron and went to the front room. She stood by the window, watching the street, not because she was idle but because vigilance was part of the job. Men thought women watched for amusement. Women watched because watching kept you alive. The lamps were being lit now, one by one. The late day was turning to evening, and the street's faces changed with the light. Respectable people hurried home. Less respectable people came out. London shifted its mask as the sky darkened. Earlier, she'd seen Frank Hogg striding along as if the pavement owed him something. He looked like a man with a purpose, jaw set, shoulders forward. She did not like men with purpose. Purpose made them careless. Careless men broke things, and broken things cost money. She'd seen Phoebe Hogg as well, young, pale, with that baby tucked against her as if it was both treasure and shield. Phoebe was a quiet tenant. Quiet tenants were the best kind. Quiet tenants paid late sometimes, but they didn't bring the police. Mrs. Wintle liked Phoebe, in the way you liked a sparrow, small, anxious, trying. She did not like Frank. Not because he was wicked. Wicked men were obvious. Wicked men bruised women where people could count the marks. Frank was the other kind, the kind who believed his wants were natural law. That kind did damage without even thinking of it as damage. The oven ticked softly, metal expanding. The pie sat waiting on the sideboard like a promise. Mrs. Wintle turned away from the window, intending to go back to her dough. Then she heard it. A thump above, not from Phoebe's room, higher. Another tenant, perhaps. Then a scraping, like furniture moved. A brief, muffled cry. Mrs. Wintle's hand froze. Her eyes narrowed. The building's sounds were as familiar to her as her own joints. She knew the difference between a dropped pot and a body hitting a wall. She knew the rhythm of quarrels, the way voices rose and fell, the thud of a fist on a table, the sudden hush when one person decided to stop arguing and start doing. This wasn't voices. This was impact. She set the rolling pin down and went out into the hall, wiping flour from her hands as if cleanliness could keep her from what she was about to learn. The air in the hallway was cooler, smelling of damp wood and other people's dinners. Somewhere, someone had boiled cabbage. The scent hung stubbornly, like a bad thought. Mrs. Wintle stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. Silence. Not ordinary silence. A held one. She climbed 2 steps, then paused, her hand gripping the banister. She felt the smoothness under her palm, wood polished by hundreds of hands. Her hands. Her tenants. Strangers. A house was a ledger of touches. Footsteps came then, careful, light, coming down. Mrs. Wintle straightened, smoothing her apron. A landlady must look in control. A woman appeared at the top of the stairs. Not Phoebe. The woman wore a bonnet pulled low and a shawl drawn tight, but Mrs. Wintle recognized her anyway. Some faces announced themselves even when they tried not to. Mary Pearcey. Mrs. Wintle's lips tightened. Mary paused for half a second, eyes scanning the stairwell like a person checking for witnesses. Then she descended, one hand sliding along the banister as if the house belonged to her. The banister Mrs. Wintle scrubbed every Saturday. Evening, Mrs. Wintle said, voice cool. Mary's gaze flicked to her. Evening, she replied, as if they were equals, as if Mrs. Wintle were merely another woman and not the one who could throw her out with a word. Mrs. Wintle didn't offer a smile. You visiting someone? Mary's mouth curved slightly. Just passing through. No one passes through my house without a reason, Mrs. Wintle said. Mary's eyes gleamed in the dimness. Is that so? Mrs. Wintle held her gaze. She had faced drunks, debt collectors, and men who tried to pay rent with charm. She was not afraid of a woman in a bonnet. Not properly. But she felt in her bones that Mary Pearcey was the kind of woman who made fear unnecessary by making people doubt their right to act. Mary's attention slid past her, toward the front door, and Mrs. Wintle noticed then that Mary's hands were bare. Damp. There was something dark on one cuff, mud perhaps. Or something else. Mary moved toward the door. Mrs. Wintle stepped slightly to block the way. Not fully, just enough that Mary had to acknowledge her. You'll wipe your boots, Mrs. Wintle said. Mary looked down, then up, amused. Worried about your floors? I'm worried about my house, Mrs. Wintle corrected. Mary's smile did not touch her eyes. Your house, she repeated, as if the phrase offended her. Then she lifted her skirt a fraction and wiped her boot against the mat with exaggerated care. There. Polite. Then she reached for the handle. Mrs. Wintle watched her fingers close around it. She saw very clearly that the knuckles were scraped, raw in places, as if they'd been dragged across something rough. The skin was broken. The nails had dirt under them, darker than street grime. Mrs. Wintle's throat tightened. Mary opened the door. Cold air swept in from outside, along with the sound of wheels on wet stone. Mrs. Wintle's gaze went past Mary's shoulder. A pram stood just outside. Not a cheap one. Not a new one. But decent. The kind a woman might have once taken pride in. Its hood was raised. The inside was shadow. Mary grasped the handle and began to push it away from the door with quick, efficient movements, as if she'd done it before. As if she'd practiced. Mrs. Wintle's stomach lurched. Is that yours? She asked, because she couldn't stop herself. Mary didn't look back. No, she said. Borrowed. Borrowed. Mrs. Wintle watched the pram's hood. It was up. The inside was dark. No baby's cry came from it. Mary pushed it out into the street and turned, the wheels squealing softly as they caught on the wet. Mrs. Wintle stepped to the threshold, looking after her. The lamps threw light across the pram's side, and for a second Mrs. Wintle saw a dark smear there, uneven, like something had been wiped in haste. It wasn't mud. Mud was dull. This had a faint shine to it where the light hit. Her mouth went dry. Oi, she called, louder than she meant. You. Mary stopped. Turned her head slightly, just enough to show a sliver of profile. What? She called back. Mrs. Wintle's mouth opened. What could she accuse her of? What did she know? Nothing. Only an unease. Only a stain. Only the unnatural quiet of that pram. You'll bring it back, Mrs. Wintle said finally, because it was the only claim she could make without sounding mad. You hear me? You'll bring it back if it belongs to a tenant. Mary laughed once, sharp. Of course, she said, as if humoring a child. Then she pushed the pram on. Mrs. Wintle stood in the doorway until Mary Pearcey disappeared around the corner. She shut the door slowly. Her hands were trembling. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself it was not her business. But her eyes went to the banister. There on the polished wood was a streak fresh, dark, glistening faintly in the hole's low light. A smear that looked like it had been made by a hand sliding down for balance. Mrs. Wintle stared at it as if it might vanish under her gaze. Her stomach clenched. She went to the kitchen and took the rag from the sink. She poured boiling water over it and scrubbed the banister hard, harder than necessary, until her arms ached and the wood looked clean again. She scrubbed because she could scrub. She could not scrub away what the smear suggested. When she finished, she held the rag up to the light. The cloth was stained a faint rust color. Mrs. Wintle's breath came quick. She shoved the rag back into the sink, as if hiding it could hide what it meant. She reached for the soap and washed her hands until the skin tightened. Then she washed them again. Upstairs, somewhere in the building, a baby began to cry. Phoebe's baby. The sound rose and fell, thin and desperate, and it made Mrs. Wintle's eyes sting in a way she did not like. She turned off the tap and stood very still, listening. The crying did not stop. A baby cried for many reasons. Hunger, cold, wind, loneliness. But this cry had a particular sharpness. Panic. The cry of a child whose world had changed and could not be soothed by milk alone. Mrs. Wintle wiped her hands on her apron and went to the bottom of the stairs. For a moment she stood there, looking up at the narrow flight, the doors on either side like shut mouths. She could feel the house around her, wood brick wallpaper, holding secrets the way a body held illness. She thought of Frank Hogg striding out with his purpose. She thought of Phoebe with her pale face and tired hands. She thought of Mary Pearcey's scraped knuckles and that silent pram. A hard anger rose in her, steadying her. Not anger at Phoebe. Not even entirely, anger at Mary. Anger at the way women were always the ones left holding the consequences. Mrs. Wintle climbed the stairs. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Steady, step by step, as if she could climb into certainty. And with each step, the baby's crying sounded louder, sharper, more wrong, like an alarm bell no one wanted to hear. Chapter 10. The Search, Chorus. They found the first sign of her in the smallest way, as if the city couldn't bear to announce itself properly. A shawl, snagged on a low branch where the path dipped. Not torn clean, ripped, as though someone had yanked it free in haste. The cloth was dark, damp, dragged with mud. A woman passing early in the morning saw it and frowned, then kept walking because she had errands and because in London you learned not to collect other people's trouble. But she mentioned it later, over a doorstep, as women did. And the mentioning was the first thread. Mrs. Darnell, with a basket. Mrs. Darnell went to the market at the same hour every day. Routine was her armor. If she kept the same route, the same stops, the same pace, then nothing could surprise her too badly. That morning the heath looked washed out, as if the sky had scrubbed the color from it overnight. Mist lay low, clinging to the grass. The paths were slick, the mud hungry for shoes. Mrs. Darnell tightened her shawl and walked faster, thinking only of cabbages and bread and the week's meals. A boy ran past her, too fast, too wild, face pinched with panic. "You'll break your neck," she shouted, irritated, and then startled by the sound of her own voice in the damp quiet. The boy didn't answer. He just ran, eyes wide, mouth open as if he'd swallowed a scream. Mrs. Darnell's irritation shifted, uneasy now. She tightened her grip on her basket and followed, not because she wanted to but because a woman's conscience was a stubborn thing. It came alive at the worst times. She found the stick in the mud first, abandoned. Then she saw what had made the boy run. She did not step closer. She didn't need to. Some sights did not require distance to be understood. Her basket slipped from her fingers and hit the ground with a soft thud. Apples rolled into the mud like small red hearts. A sound escaped her, small, involuntary, as if her body could not decide whether to pray or vomit. She backed away without turning her back, because some part of her still believed the thing on the ground might move. Tommy Briggs, the boy. Tommy had only meant to chase his hoop. He'd been told not to go near the wet ground because it swallowed boots and mothers didn't want to scrub mud off socks at the end of the day. Tommy went anyway, because boys were born with a kind of stubbornness that did not understand consequence. The hoop rolled off the path, wobbling, and Tommy followed it down a dip where the grass was flattened. He stopped because the grass didn't flatten itself like that. Not unless someone had been there. Not unless something heavy had been dragged. He saw a bundle first. It lay low in the hollow, half hidden by reeds. Cloth. Skirt. A shawl twisted wrong. A shape too still. Tommy swallowed hard. He poked it once with his stick. The bundle did not move. He poked again, harder, anger rising because fear always turned into anger when you were a boy. As if anger could push fear away. A smell rose up, sweet and wrong. Like meat left too long. Like something you should not breathe. Tommy's stomach turned. He dropped the stick and ran. He ran until the world became only his own feet and the pounding in his ears. He ran until he found a woman and tried to speak and could only make noise. A laborer, stopping. There was a man with a barrow nearby, headed toward a job. He saw Mrs. Darnell standing frozen, saw the basket on the ground, and assumed she'd fainted or lost her senses. "Oi," he called, rough with impatience. "What's the matter?" Mrs. Darnell turned her face to him. It looked grey. "Get a policeman," she said. The man frowned. "For what?" Mrs. Darnell swallowed once hard. "For that." He followed the line of her gaze. His expression changed in a blink, as if a hand had reached inside him and turned something. He didn't ask another question. He left the barrow in the path and ran. "Constable Weller, again." Weller heard the report in pieces, which was how all bad news arrived. A boy shouting, a woman weeping, a man out of breath, words tripping over each other. "On the heath, there's..." Weller didn't wait for the sentence to find its end. He moved. He ran, boots slipping on wet stone, breath burning in his throat. The streets narrowed as he went, then opened into the damp space of the heath where the air tasted of wet earth and rot. A cold wind worried at his collar. Men gathered first, always men, drawn by the promise of spectacle. Women hung back, faces tight, hands covering mouths, because women understood what bodies meant. Weller pushed through. He saw the bundle. He saw, too, the way the grass had been pressed down in a line, as if something heavy had been dragged. Dragged from where? His stomach clenched with a terrible familiarity, the memory of a pram, a hood too still, a woman pushing too hard. He forced himself to step closer. Forced himself to be the uniform, the promise. He crouched. He did not touch. He didn't need to. Even from a respectful distance, you could see the shape of death. The slackness of a body that no longer held itself. The dullness of skin. Weller swallowed bile. He stood again slowly, as if his body were made of wood. "Clear back," he ordered, voice steady despite the sickness rising in his throat. "Clear back, all of you." No one moved at first. They never did. People loved a tragedy until it asked something of them. Weller blew his whistle. The shrill sound cut through the fog and made heads jerk. The crowd jumped, startled, and then began to obey, murmuring, shifting, hungry eyes retreating by inches. Weller's gaze swept the onlookers. A woman sobbed quietly behind her glove. A man muttered, "Bloody hell," with relish, as if horror was a treat. Weller felt anger flare. Not at them exactly. At the whole shape of it, how quickly a woman's body became a public event. He turned away and sent a runner for the inspector. Mrs. Wintle, at the lodging house. Mrs. Wintle arrived at Phoebe Hogg's door with her heart banging in her chest. She knocked once, then again, sharper. "Mrs. Hogg." The baby was crying inside. Not the hungry cry. Not the tired cry. The panic cry. Mrs. Wintle tried the handle. Unlocked. Her stomach lurched. She opened the door. The room was too quiet in the wrong places, no kettle singing, no woman moving. Only the baby's cry, thin and relentless. It filled the room like smoke. Mrs. Wintle crossed fast, boots loud on the floorboards. She lifted the baby from the cot, shushing automatically. His cheeks were wet, his face red with effort, fists clenched like he was fighting the air itself. There, she muttered, though her voice shook. "There now." "Where's your mum, love?" she whispered, though she knew babies didn't answer. Babies only demanded. Her eyes darted over the room. The tablecloth was skewed, pulled sideways as if someone had caught it in haste. One chair was tipped, a leg wedged awkwardly against the wall. A cup lay on its side, tea dried dark along the saucer's rim like old blood. There was a smell, iron and damp, and something she didn't want to name. Mrs. Wintle's gaze went to the hearth. A dark mark there. A smear on the brick, as if something wet had been pressed and dragged. Her mouth went dry. She clutched the baby closer and backed toward the door. In the hall she stopped, listening. No footsteps. No voice. No sign of Phoebe at all. Mrs. Wintle felt something cold settle behind her ribs. She carried the baby downstairs and shouted for her neighbor to fetch a constable. Her voice came out too loud, too sharp, and she didn't care who heard. Let them hear. Let them know. Let them stop pretending. In her kitchen she laid the baby in her arms like he belonged there and walked back upstairs with a shaking hand to lock Phoebe's door from the outside. A gesture of protection. A gesture of possession. A way of telling herself she could still control something. The baby's cries softened slightly, exhausted. Mrs. Wintle stared at the child's face and felt something harden inside her. Not pity. Resolve. Because whatever had happened, whatever story the street would begin to tell, she would not allow this child to be swallowed by it too. The reporter, at the edge. By midday the rumor had outrun the facts. A body on Hampstead Heath. A woman. A child missing. A lover's quarrel. A jealous rival. A pram scene in the evening. Blood on a stair rail. The police tight-lipped, which meant the papers could write whatever they liked. A reporter stood at the edge of the cordon, notebook open, eyes bright with hunger. He didn't write names at first. Names were less useful than types. He wrote, a young wife. He wrote, a mysterious woman. He wrote, a shocking discovery. He wrote because London would buy the story faster if it already knew how to feel. Constable Weller, a private note. When Weller returned to the station to make his report, his hands were steady, but his mind was not. He wrote down what he had seen, the woman, the pram, the late hour. He wrote down what he had not done, stopped her, called for help, insisted. He wrote it all in the language of procedure, because procedure was the only thing that kept a man from breaking under the weight of his own guilt. And when he finished, he stared at the ink until it blurred. He thought of the young mother's eyes when he'd asked, everything all right? He thought of her quick, frightened yes. He thought bitterly, if she had said no, I could have acted. Then he thought softer, worse. If I had acted anyway, she might still be alive. Outside the station, London moved on, already telling itself the story. And somewhere in that story, Phoebe Hogg began to vanish. Into headlines, into types, into the easy cruelty of a city that loved a tragedy as long as it could keep it at arm's length. Chapter 11. The Reporter. Edwin Sloane wrote faster when he was afraid. It wasn't a noble fear. Not fear of the dead. Fear of being beaten to print. Fear of another man's byline sitting where his should have been. Fear of missing the story that would buy him a better coat, a better desk, a better life. London didn't reward restraint. London rewarded speed. He arrived at the police station with ink already drying on his fingers, collar turned up against the damp, hat pulled low like every other man with ambition. The entrance was crowded with the usual flock, clerks, curious citizens, one or two other reporters pretending they weren't reporters. Everyone wore the same expression, interest disguised as concern. Sloane pushed through with the quiet aggression of someone who believed doors ought to open for him. Inside, the air smelled of wet wool and stale tobacco. A constable's boots squeaked on the floor. Someone laughed too loudly somewhere back in the building, as if humor could keep horror outside. Sloane moved toward the desk where information leaked if you knew how to press it. Edwin Sloane, the Chronicle, he said, sliding a card across as if a name could buy access. The desk sergeant barely glanced at it. No statement. Sloane smiled anyway. Not even a confirmation. The sergeant's eyes were flat. No statement. Men like that prided themselves on holding their tongues. It made them feel powerful. It made them forget that silence was its own kind of language. Sloane leaned in slightly, lowering his voice like a friend. It's already out there, he said. You know it is. If you don't give me the shape of it, someone else will. The sergeant's jaw tightened. Someone else can write lies. You can too. Sloane's smile did not waver. I can write what people will believe, he corrected. The sergeant stared at him, then looked away, dismissing him with his body. End of conversation. Sloane straightened, annoyance flaring. He hated being blocked by men who thought duty made them superior. He hated more that the sergeant was right. The story was already out there, rushing through London like fire through dry straw. He stepped back into the corridor and began doing what he did best. Listening. Police stations were full of men who thought they weren't being overheard. Voices carried. Doors didn't quite shut. Paper moved. A name spoken once could become a headline by nightfall. Sloane lingered near an open doorway, pretending to read a notice, and caught fragments. Woman found. Child not yet. Pram. Hampstead. Mrs. Hogg. Mrs. Hogg. The name struck a familiar note. Not because it mattered to him as a person, but because it mattered as a type. A married woman. A wife. A wife made a cleaner story than a girl. A wife meant betrayal, jealousy, domestic tragedy. A wife meant readers could feel safe thinking, that happens to other people. Sloane moved toward the station's outer room where the public waited and watched. He saw a woman there, hunched and pale, clutching a bundle that cried weakly in her arms. The baby. Sloane's breath caught, not with sympathy, but with opportunity. The woman holding the baby wasn't the mother. Older. Sturdier. The kind of woman who would call herself practical and mean it as virtue. A landlady, Sloane guessed. That made sense. Landladies always turned up in stories like this. They were gatekeepers of respectability and witnesses to its collapse. He approached with his most careful face. "Ma'am," he said softly, "because you did not shout at grief in public if you wanted to be paid for it later. I'm from the paper. I'm so sorry." The woman looked up sharply, eyes red and furious. "Get away," she snapped. Sloane lifted his hands slightly, harmless. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he lied. "Only to make sure the truth." "The truth," the woman repeated, and the contempt in it could have stripped paint. "You lot don't want truth. You want blood." The baby cried again, a thin rasp. The woman adjusted him automatically, rocking, shushing. Her hands were competent. Her mouth was shaking. Sloane softened his voice further, letting it turn grave, almost reverent. "The public will hear something," he said. "If it's not from someone who cares, it will be ugly." The woman hesitated. Sloane saw it, the tiny opening. He did not press hard. He pressed gently, like a thumb on a bruise. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked. The woman's lips tightened. "Mrs. Wintle." Sloane nodded as if he already knew, as if her name mattered. It did, in print. Names made stories feel real. "And the mother?" he asked, careful, as if the question pained him. Mrs. Wintle's face contorted. "Phoebe," she said, and the name came out like a wound. "Phoebe Hogg." Phoebe. Sloane stored it away. "And the child?" he asked. "A boy." Mrs. Wintle's eyes flashed. "You don't need his name." Sloane let himself look chastened. "No," he said. "No, of course." He paused. Did you find him?" Mrs. Wintle's gaze dropped to the baby. "He was in his cot," she said, voice tight. "Crying. Alone. Alone." Sloane's mind began arranging phrases like furniture. A helpless infant found wailing. A mother's mysterious disappearance. Blood in the lodging house. "What happened in the room?" he asked, very softly. Mrs. Wintle's jaw clenched. Her eyes flicked to a constable nearby, then back to Sloane. "Nothing you can write," she said. Sloane inclined his head. "I understand," he said, as if he did. "Was there evidence? Signs of a struggle?" Mrs. Wintle's mouth tightened further. She didn't answer. Silence could be quoted as easily as speech. Silence implied everything. Sloane nodded as if she'd confirmed it. "And your tenant, Mrs. Hogg, she'd been seen with someone, is that right?" Mrs. Wintle's gaze snapped up. "Who told you that?" Sloane let his face show mild surprise, as if it were common knowledge. "People talk," he said. Mrs. Wintle's grip on the baby tightened. "People always talk," she said bitterly. "Yes," Sloane agreed. "But sometimes they talk about the wrong person." He leaned in slightly. "Who was she seen with, ma'am?" Mrs. Wintle stared at him with hatred. "You'll make her into a—" She cut herself off, swallowing. "You'll make her into something." Sloane kept his expression smooth. "Only what's true." Mrs. Wintle's lips trembled. Then, with a kind of defeated anger, she whispered, "Mary Pearcey." There it was. Sloane felt a thrill that made his stomach flutter, shameful and familiar. A name with an edge. A name that sounded like trouble. A woman who could be cast. "Mary Pearcey," he repeated softly, as if tasting it. Mrs. Wintle's eyes filled. "Don't," she said. "Don't you do it." Sloane held up his hands again, solemn. "I won't malign anyone," he promised, already imagining the headline. A jealous rival. A wronged woman. A fallen creature. A Mrs. without the ring. London would devour it. He stepped back, murmuring thanks, condolences, false blessings. He moved away quickly before she could change her mind. Outside, the street was alive with mouths. He could already hear the story forming in the crowd, like a chorus warming up. Sloane walked fast, boots splashing through puddles. He had notes. He had names. He had the shape of a tragedy that could be sold. In his head, Phoebe became a symbol, the young wife, the innocent mother, the respectable victim. Mary Pearcey became an outline, the other woman, the predator, the threat. Frank Hogg, ah yes, Frank would be the hinge. The man between them. The reason. Men were always the reason and never the guilty party in print unless the facts demanded it. He reached his office and took his seat, heart racing, pen poised. The desk was scarred with old ink marks. The window rattled faintly in the wind. His editor shouted somewhere in the background, impatient as a hungry dog. Sloane wrote. A shocking crime in North London. He wrote. A young wife and mother. He wrote. A mysterious woman. Each phrase placed a person into a cage made of words. He did not think of Phoebe's hands laying a tablecloth straight, or her mouth whispering to her baby. He did not think of the baby's small sigh when he slept. Those details were too human. Humans complicated stories. He thought of readers. He thought of coin. He thought of being first. Outside his window, London's gas lamps burned steadily, lighting streets that would soon be thick with people repeating his sentences as if they were truth. And somewhere in the city, the real truth, whatever it was, sat in silence, waiting for someone brave enough to see it without turning it into theatre. Chapter 12. The Doctor. Dr. Ambrose Larkin disliked crowds. Crowds made medicine into theatre. They made men ask for miracles and women ask for forgiveness. They stood too close, breathing on your neck as if you were a priest. A physician's work required space, distance enough to think, enough to keep the mind from becoming the body's panic. But London did not permit distance, not even for death. They summoned him in the grey hour between morning and noon, when the city smelled of wet brick and coal smoke and yesterday's meals. A messenger boy arrived breathless at his surgery with a note that was already smudged. Larkin read it once, folded it neatly, and put on his coat with the same careful motions he used when he washed his hands, precise, practiced, an attempt at control. He carried his bag like a man carrying a duty he did not want but could not refuse. At Hampstead Heath the air was colder than in town, thinner, sharp with wet grass. Mist lay low and made the world feel muffled, as if the city had wrapped the scene in cloth to soften the blow. It didn't soften anything. It only made shapes more ghostly. A constable met him at the edge and guided him along a muddy path where the grass lay flattened in a line. Dragged, Larkin noted immediately. He said nothing. A doctor did not speculate aloud in front of policemen. Speculation became rumor too easily. Rumor became headlines. Headlines became truth in the mouths of people who needed their world simple. The crowd had formed despite the cordon, men craning, women holding shawls tight, boys half hoping for horror and half terrified of it. Larkin could feel their eyes on him, hungry and reverent. He hated it. He hated the way grief was always a spectacle for someone. The constable lifted the rope and ushered him through. There, in a dip where the ground held water, lay the body. Larkin had seen enough bodies to recognize the particular stillness of violent death. It was not the stillness of illness. It was not the slow, tired surrender of age. It was the stillness of interruption, as if life had been stopped mid-sentence. The woman's clothing was damp and disarranged. Her skirt was muddied along one side, the hem heavy with wet. Her hair had come loose, dark strands stuck to her cheek. The skin of her face was pale with that faint grey cast that came when blood had settled where it would. A woman, Larkin thought. Young. Not a vagrant, her clothes weren't rags, only worn. A mother, perhaps. He had learned over years to see motherhood even without a child present. The roughness of hands, the faint milk smell that sometimes clung to fabric, the way a body held itself even in death as if it still remembered carrying weight. He set his bag down carefully, knelt, and began. He did not pray. He did not flinch. He did not speak to the dead as some men did. He simply looked. The constable beside him cleared his throat. Doctor. Larkin held up one finger, asking for silence without words. He examined the hands first. A habit. Hands told stories people's mouths wouldn't. The fingers were scratched. Not badly, but enough. There was dirt under the nails. A strip of skin at one knuckle was torn back as if she'd struck wood or stone. The left palm had a raw patch, fresh. Defensive, he thought. Or desperate. He moved to the wrists. No marks there that suggested rope, no deep ligature impressions. But there was bruising on the forearm, finger-shaped perhaps. A grip. His jaw tightened. He leaned closer to the head and neck. The hat was gone. The throat showed bruising, dark and uneven. Beneath it, worse, an indentation that suggested force applied with knowledge. Not a casual scuffle. Not a lover's slap. Pressure placed where pressure ended breath. Larkin felt his stomach tighten, not with squeamishness but with anger. There was a particular cruelty in silencing a woman. A cruelty that felt personal even when you did not know her. He lifted a portion of her hair carefully and saw the wound. A blow to the head. Blood had matted the strands near the crown, dark and sticky even in the damp. The skull beneath felt, he pressed gently, unforgivingly wrong. A severe strike. Enough to stun, perhaps to kill. And then, he looked again at the neck bruising. Sequence, he reminded himself. Don't leap. But his mind, trained by years of putting death into order, began to arrange it anyway. A blow, a fall, a hand at the throat. Violence done with haste and with intent. He drew back slightly and looked at the woman's face. The eyes were half-lidded, lashes stuck together with moisture. The mouth was slightly open. She looked almost as if she might speak. Larkin swallowed. He glanced at the constable. Name? He asked quietly. Phoebe Hogg, the man said quickly, eager to be useful. Married. Lodger. One child. The name landed in Larkin's mind like a weight. A person, not a body. A daughter, perhaps. A woman who had lived in rooms with other people's walls too close. One child, Larkin repeated, more to himself than to the constable. A baby, the constable said. Not found yet. Larkin's chest tightened. He made himself keep his face neutral. Neutrality was part of the job. But inside, something clenched hard. He opened his bag and took out his small notebook. He wrote with the quick, tidy hand of a man trained to make horror legible. Female. Adult. Blow to the head, severe. Bruising to the neck consistent with pressure. Signs of struggle present. Body appears to have been dragged. He could feel the crowd's attention burning into the back of his neck as if it were a physical thing. Someone murmured behind the rope. Someone sniffed. A woman sobbed softly. A man said, not quite whispering, serves her right, out at night. Larkin's pen paused. He turned his head slightly toward the sound. His gaze caught the man, middle-aged, cheap coat, mouth already shaped into judgment. Larkin's eyes were calm when he spoke, which made the words sharper. Back, he said. Let the dead have space. The constable's whistle shrilled. The crowd shifted, chastened for a moment. Larkin returned to his work. They moved the body carefully with the awkward gentleness of men who did not often touch women unless they had permission. A stretcher was brought. The ground sucked at their boots. The woman's hair trailed briefly in the grass before someone lifted it free. When they raised her, her arm swung slightly with emotion, limp and human. For a second, something inside Larkin shifted, an unwanted tenderness. He imagined her alive, hands wet from washing, hair pinned up, a baby's weight on her hip. He imagined the small domestic courage it took to keep living in a city like this. Then the stretcher steadied, and the moment passed. Back at the station later, in a smaller room that smelled of ink and damp wool, Larkin washed his hands. The water ran brown at first from mud and dried blood. He scrubbed until his skin reddened, because doctors scrubbed when they could not change what they'd seen. Inspector Baines came in while he was drying his hands. Baines was a heavy man with tired eyes and a voice like gravel. He listened without interrupting, which Larkin appreciated. Policemen and doctors shared a certain kinship. Both were asked to tidy chaos into something the public could accept. She was struck, Larkin said, choosing his words carefully. Hard. A blow to the head. Enough to incapacitate. Possibly fatal in itself. Then, pressure to the neck. Bruising suggests force applied deliberately. Baines nodded slowly. A man's work, he muttered. Larkin felt irritation flare. Violence has no sex, he said. Only opportunity. Baines looked at him, surprised, then grunted. Aye, fair. What about the child? Larkin asked again, unable to let it go. Has the baby been located? Baines's jaw worked. Not yet. Larkin stared at the table's worn surface. Find him, he said quietly, as if command could make it happen. Baines's eyes flicked up. Something like discomfort crossed his face. There's a pram, he said. Witnesses say they saw a woman pushing one late last night. Near the heath. Larkin's mind tightened around the detail. A woman, he repeated. Baines nodded. Mary Pearcey. That's the name going round. Known to be involved with the husband. Larkin's mouth tightened. Names always went round before facts did. London loved a villain it could picture. And Mr. Hogg? Larkin asked. The husband. Baines's lips compressed. Frank Hogg. Furniture remover. Says he was out. Out, Larkin echoed. Baines shrugged. They're all out until they're not. Larkin closed his notebook. He felt a cold heaviness settling in his chest, the sense of being inside a machine he could not stop. The machine of investigation. The machine of court. The machine of newspapers. Outside the station, he could hear the crowd again, murmuring, building their story with each repetition. The dead woman's name already being shaped into a lesson for the living. Larkin thought of the bruises on Phoebe Hogg's throat. He thought of the effort it took to keep a person from making sound. A quiet murder, he thought. Not because it was gentle, but because it was designed to keep the world from intervening. He put on his coat and stepped back into the wet London air, feeling older than he had that morning. As he walked away, he realized with a bleak clarity, whatever the truth was, it would have to survive the city's appetite first. And not many truths did. Chapter 13. The Court Clerk. Arthur Pell liked ink because ink did not argue. People argued. People wept. People swore oaths and then broke them with their next breath. People made stories out of themselves until even they believed them. But ink stayed where you put it. Ink was obedient. Ink turned noise into record. That was what Arthur Pell did for a living. He made noise obedient. On the morning the Pearcey case was listed, the Old Bailey felt like a mouth already watering. Arthur arrived early, as he always did, coat brushed, collar neat, pen trimmed. The court still held last night's cold in its stone, and the smell inside was a familiar mixture: old paper, damp wool, ink, and the faint sourness of too many bodies pressed close together in anticipation. He set his papers on the clerk's desk and checked them twice, because checking was his only superstition. He had no religion for comfort. He had procedure. The gallery began to fill with the slow certainty of a tide. Women in bonnets clustered together, whispering behind gloves. Men leaned forward as if their bodies could pull the truth closer. The press benches filled too, reporters with sharp faces, sharpened pencils, impatience in their posture. Arthur's gaze skimmed them and returned to his own orderly stack. When Mary Pearcey was brought in, the room changed. It was not loud. It was not even fully visible. It was a shift in attention, a tightening, a collective leaning, as if everyone's spine had angled toward her at the same time. Arthur looked up despite himself. She was smaller than the newspapers had made her, which was always the way. Scandal enlarged people. In truth, she was compact and composed, dressed in black that sat well on her. Her hands were folded neatly before her, as if she were attending church. Her face was pale under the harsh light, mouth set in a line that refused to tremble. The public wanted a monster. Mary Pearcey did not oblige them by drooling. Arthur's pen hovered. He reminded himself, accused. Not guilty. Words mattered. In court, words were knives and the clerk's job was to keep the blades sharp. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The room became briefly orderly, then sank back into its restless shape as soon as they sat again. Arthur wrote the formalities as they unfolded: date, court, charge, his hand moving automatically. The indictment was read. Willful murder. The words landed in the air like a stone thrown into still water. Ripples ran through the gallery, a whisper, a sigh, a suppressed gasp. Arthur wrote it down with the same neat hand he used for theft and assault and fraud. The page did not change color for blood. It never did. The prosecution began with the story it had chosen: jealousy, revenge, the other woman who would not accept replacement. Arthur had heard the shape of it already in the press and in the street. Court stories were often street stories with better grammar. Witnesses were called. One by one they came forward, bodies stiff with nerves, voices thick with fear or excitement. Arthur wrote their names, their statements, their stumbles. He wrote what they claimed they saw, what they thought they heard, what they remembered, and what they had been reminded of by other people's talk. A neighbor described Phoebe Hogg's quietness, her decency, her baby. A landlady described the room and the crying and the smear on the banister. A constable described the pram scene late, the woman's face half hidden by bonnet. An omnibus conductor described a hood too still, a smell he couldn't forget. Arthur wrote it all, his wrist beginning to ache, his mind quietly making its own tally. How much of this was certainty and how much was inference stitched into certainty because people needed it that way? He felt, in the back of his mind, a faint unease. Not doubt, exactly. Arthur had never been a man who indulged in doubt. More like the awareness that every witness in that room was performing, even the ones who didn't mean to. The courtroom made performance out of truth. It demanded clear shapes, victim, villain, motive. It did not like blurred edges. Frank Hogg's name was spoken and the gallery murmured, as if the room itself had been waiting for the man who connected the women. Arthur glanced up. Frank sat behind, not in the dock. That mattered. Men like Frank were often present in the story and absent from punishment. He looked tired, or he looked like he'd practiced looking tired. His hair was neat, his coat respectable enough. His face held a careful grief that made some women in the gallery soften. Arthur watched him for a moment, then looked away. A clerk's gaze was not meant to linger. Still, Arthur noted the way Frank kept his eyes down when Mary Pearcey entered. The way he did not look at her as she stood accused. The way he looked instead at the judge, at the floor, at anywhere that wasn't the woman who might speak truths he could not manage. It was a small observation, the kind a clerk was trained to ignore. Arthur did not ignore it. Then the exhibits were brought. Objects always changed the room. People could doubt words, but they believed in things. The perambulator was wheeled in, and a low sound rose from the gallery, a collective intake, half horror, half excitement. Arthur saw women press gloved hands to their mouths. He saw a boy lean forward until his mother yanked him back by the collar. Arthur's stomach tightened. He looked at the pram and felt something uneasy, the way an ordinary domestic object could be made into a weapon simply by being present in a story like this. A cloth was produced. Stains described. A few measurements recited. Arthur wrote the descriptions in the careful language of court, marks consistent with, appearances suggestive of. Not blood, unless someone swore it was blood. Not murder, unless the verdict had been given. Mary Pearcey watched with a calm that made people angry. Arthur could feel the anger in the room, a low, simmering resentment that a woman accused of such a thing would not satisfy the public's thirst for remorse. They wanted her to cry. They wanted her to confess with her face. She did not. At one point her gaze lifted, sweeping the room as if she were taking inventory. It passed over Arthur Pell's desk. For a second, her eyes met his. Arthur's fingers tightened on his pen. There was nothing supernatural in it. No witchcraft, no glamour. Just a woman looking at a man who was turning her life into ink. Arthur looked down quickly and continued writing. Later, the medical evidence was given, and the room quieted in a different way. Even the hungriest spectators had limits. They wanted horror, yes, but they wanted it wrapped in professional language so they could pretend they were respectable while consuming it. Dr. Larkin spoke in measured sentences. Blow to the head. Bruising to the neck. Likely sequence. Likely time. Arthur wrote likely twice, and in his mind he underlined it, because likely was where doubt lived. Courts tolerated doubt only when it served the story they already wanted. The prosecution spoke of motive. Jealousy. Resentment. The other woman who would not release her claim. The wife who had taken what was promised. Arthur heard the way the words were arranged, how the prosecution chose phrases that made Mary Pearcey sound like a storm, like a disease, like something that crept into a respectable household and ruined it. A phrase repeated, a woman of violent disposition. Arthur wrote it down, though the phrase made his skin prickle. Disposition was such a convenient thing to accuse someone of. It allowed the court to punish not just an act, but a nature. Mary's counsel objected, then argued. Insufficient proof. Inference. Unreliable witnesses. Sensationalism. Arthur wrote those too, though he knew the room heard them like buzzing flies, annoying, easily ignored. At one point the defense suggested another possibility, careful and indirect. Arthur looked up, briefly. Frank Hogg's face remained composed. Too composed. Arthur returned to his page. As the afternoon wore on, the courtroom grew warm and sour with bodies. People fanned themselves with hats. A child in the gallery was hushed. Arthur's wrist cramped from writing. His ink blotted once, and he felt shame as if he'd committed a sin. Errors in ink were small betrayals. He thought suddenly of Phoebe Hogg, whose name was spoken often and yet who was not present except as description. The deceased. The victim. A body on paper. He wondered what her voice had sounded like when she was alive. He wondered who had ever written down her words. When the judge began his summing up, Arthur's pen slowed, not from fatigue but from a strange reluctant awareness that what he wrote now would outlive everyone in the room. The judge spoke of duty, of evidence, of morality. He spoke with the careful cadence of a man who knew his words could send someone to death. Mary Pearcey stood very still. Arthur watched her hands. They were clasped, fingers interlaced tightly enough to whiten the knuckles. For the first time all day he saw something human in her composure, effort. Not fear, exactly. Control. The verdict came. Guilty. The word landed in the room like a heavy object dropped from a height. The gallery exhaled as if relieved. Some people made small satisfied sounds. A woman began to cry, either from triumph or grief, Arthur couldn't tell which. Mary Pearcey did not collapse. She did not scream. She did not plead. She only blinked once slowly, as if the word had passed through her and out the other side. Arthur wrote it down. Guilty. Ink, neat and final. When the court emptied and Arthur gathered his papers, the air felt thinner, the hunger spent. People filed out chattering, as if they'd attended a play. The reporters hurried, already shaping the verdict into outrage or satisfaction. Arthur remained seated for a moment after everyone else had gone, looking at the page. He thought with a dull heaviness that in 100 years someone would read these lines and think they understood. As if a woman could be contained by a verdict. As if Phoebe's life could be reduced to a cause of death. As if a city's appetite could be mistaken for truth. Arthur capped his ink. He filed the papers. He stood, straightened his cuffs, and walked out into the London afternoon, leaving behind a room that had decided what story it preferred. Outside, the street continued as if nothing had happened. And Arthur Pell, who had made the noise obedient, carried the unease of it home like soot on his sleeves. Chapter 14. Phoebe's mother. Mrs. Styles had never liked London. It was too loud, too close, too hungry. It took girls from the country and sent women back in boxes. It made you feel as though you were always being watched and never being seen. She arrived at Euston with her shawl pulled tight and her hands clenched inside it, knuckles aching. The journey had taken hours. The waiting had taken longer. All the way, her mind had tried to bargain with God the way minds did when they were being pulled toward the worst truth. Let it be a mistake. Let it be another woman. Let her be hurt but living. Let her be. Every version of mercy ended in the same place, Phoebe's name. At the station, men brushed past her without apology. A porter shouted. A child cried. A woman laughed too loudly. The whole city seemed to vibrate with other people's urgency. Mrs. Styles stood still for a moment, clutching her bag and swallowing the panic that kept rising like bile. She forced her feet to move. You could not stop. Stopping was how you fell apart. A constable directed her. Another man told her the address again, as if she were slow-witted. The streets blurred past, shops, soot, faces, wheels. London's noise hit her in waves. She felt like she was walking through water. By the time she reached the lodging house, she was shaking with exhaustion and fury. The building was narrower than she expected, pressed close to its neighbors like a poor woman pressed into a corner. The brick was stained. The steps were damp. The door's paint was chipped as if even color could not survive here. Mrs. Styles paused on the step, staring at the door as if the wood might answer her questions. Her hand lifted, trembled, knocked. A woman opened the door, sturdy, older, face lined by work. Her eyes flicked over Mrs. Styles, taking inventory. Yes? the woman said, cautious. I'm Phoebe's mother, Mrs. Stiles managed, and heard her own voice come out thin and wrong. I'm Mrs. Stiles. The woman's expression shifted. It hardened, then softened, then hardened again. A person deciding how much kindness she could afford. Mrs. Wintle stepped back. Come in, she said. Inside, the air was warm with cooking and something else, something sour that had settled into the walls. Mrs. Stiles's stomach turned. She had known houses like this, houses where too many lives tried to fit into too few rooms. Houses where privacy was a luxury and silence was suspicious. Where is she? Mrs. Stiles asked, and then hated herself for asking as if Phoebe might be in the next room like a child playing quiet. Mrs. Wintle's mouth tightened. Not here, she said. Mrs. Stiles's throat closed. Where is my daughter? Mrs. Wintle didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the kitchen, then toward the bundle in her arms, Phoebe's baby, awake now, mouth working in search of comfort. The child's small sounds pierced Mrs. Stiles's chest like needles. That's, Mrs. Stiles began, her voice breaking. That's him. Mrs. Wintle nodded once. He's safe, she said. As safe as we can keep him. Mrs. Stiles stepped forward without thinking, hands reaching. She took the baby into her arms and felt the familiar miracle of weight, warm, living, impossibly small. She buried her face briefly against his head and inhaled him, as if she could find Phoebe in his smell. Milk. Wool. The faint tang of soap. Her knees almost gave. Oh, love, she whispered to the baby, though she meant it for Phoebe. Oh, my love. The baby's eyes blinked up at her, solemn, startled. Then he scrunched his face and began to wail, thin and furious, as if he knew something was wrong and could not name it. Mrs. Stiles rocked him, awkward at first, then with the old muscle memory of motherhood. There now, she murmured. There. Her eyes lifted to Mrs. Wintle. Tell me, she said, and the words were a command now. Tell me what's happened. Mrs. Wintle's eyes flickered away. You should sit. I don't want to sit, Mrs. Stiles snapped, and felt guilty immediately. Mrs. Wintle had done nothing wrong. But guilt was useless beside grief. Just tell me. Mrs. Wintle drew in a breath. She went out, she said slowly. Yesterday. With the baby. Then she came back, without, she stopped, swallowing. Without her husband. And later she was gone. Mrs. Stiles stared. Gone how? Mrs. Wintle's jaw worked. She didn't come back. Mrs. Stiles felt her heart begin to pound in a hard, panicked rhythm. And you didn't, she stopped. Because what? What could Mrs. Wintle have done? It was easy to demand action from the living after the moment had passed. She had no business going out with that woman, Mrs. Wintle added, anger flaring through her practicality. None. That woman, Mrs. Stiles repeated, though she already knew. The message had been vague, but London never stayed vague for long. Names seeped into everything. Mrs. Wintle's mouth tightened. Mary Pearcey. The name meant nothing to Mrs. Stiles. It was just sound. But she saw how it changed Mrs. Wintle's face, how it tightened her mouth and sharpened her eyes. A name that carried a story. And Frank? Mrs. Stiles asked, forcing the next question through her throat. Where is Frank? Mrs. Wintle's expression twisted. He's been in and out, she said. He's said his piece. He's got men's ways of being upset. Mrs. Stiles heard the contempt under it and felt a small bitter relief. Good. Let someone else see him clearly. And the police? Mrs. Stiles asked. Her voice was steadier now, frighteningly calm. Sometimes grief made a woman soft. Sometimes it made her sharp as glass. Mrs. Wintle hesitated. They found her, she said. Mrs. Stiles went very still. The baby's crying softened, as if he sensed the stillness and feared it. They found her, Mrs. Stiles repeated, and it wasn't a question because her body already knew the answer. Mrs. Wintle nodded once. Mrs. Stiles felt her vision narrow. She saw suddenly and vividly Phoebe as a girl, hair loose, knees muddy, running in from the yard with a scraped palm and a grin, holding out a dead bird she'd found as if it were treasure. Phoebe crying at her first fever. Phoebe on her wedding day, mouth tight with nerves, eyes shining anyway. Phoebe holding the baby for the first time, face split open with love and terror. All those versions of her daughter flashed through Mrs. Styles's mind and then fell away like paper burned. A sound came out of her, low raw. It wasn't a scream. It was older than screaming. It was a mother's body recognizing loss. Mrs. Wintle stepped closer, awkward, hands half raised as if to touch and not sure she had the right. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words were plain because there were no fancy ones for this. Mrs. Styles bent over the baby, shielding him with her body. Tears fell onto his blanket. She wiped them quickly, ashamed, as if tears were weakness. But she could not stop. After a time she straightened, breathing hard through her nose like someone trying to keep control of a flood. "Who did it?" she asked. Mrs. Wintle's gaze slid away. "They've arrested a woman," she said carefully. "A woman," Mrs. Styles repeated, and bitterness rose. "Of course. London always liked a woman to blame." "Who?" "Mary Pearcey." Mrs. Styles looked down at the baby. "And Frank?" she asked softly. "What about Frank?" Mrs. Wintle's expression was bleak. "Frank is still a man," she said. "He's walking about. He's breathing. He's got people saying poor fellow to him. That's what about Frank." A hard, cold clarity settled into Mrs. Styles's chest. She had come to London wanting mercy. There would be none. There would be only endurance. She shifted the baby higher, cradling him with practiced care. Her arms knew what to do even as her mind shattered. "What happens now?" she asked. Mrs. Wintle hesitated. "The court will have its way," she said. "The papers will have theirs." Mrs. Styles felt nausea rise. "They'll talk about her," she whispered. "They'll talk about Phoebe." "They already are," Mrs. Wintle said, anger fierce now. "They're making her into a story. They're making her into a lesson." Mrs. Styles's jaw clenched. "She wasn't a lesson," she said. "She was my girl." Silence sat between them. Outside, someone walked past laughing. A cart rattled. Ordinary life, continuing like a cruelty. Mrs. Styles kissed the baby's head. "I'm taking him," she said suddenly. Not asking. Deciding. A mother's decision was the last power she had. Mrs. Wintle blinked. "Where?" "Home," Mrs. Styles said, and the words sounded like a prayer and a promise. "Away from this place. Away from their mouths." Mrs. Wintle's eyes softened. "You'll need papers," she said quietly. "Things. Proof. The police." "I'll do whatever they want," Mrs. Styles said. "I'll sign. I'll swear. I'll beg if I must." Her voice broke on the last part. "But I won't let them take him too." Mrs. Wintle nodded once. "All right," she said. "All right. We'll do it proper." Mrs. Styles stood there in the small kitchen, holding Phoebe's child, and felt the world reorganize itself around one brutal truth. Her daughter was gone. Everything else, court, newspapers, blame, was noise. But the child's warm breath on her arm was not noise. It was life. Mrs. Styles lifted her chin, tears drying stiff on her cheeks. In London, they would tell Phoebe's story however they pleased. But in her own house, in her own arms, Mrs. Styles would tell Phoebe's story differently. She would tell it as it had been. A girl who tried. A woman who loved. A mother who deserved to come home. Chapter 15. The verdict, outside the Old Bailey. The crowd arrived early, as if justice were a performance you could get a good seat for. Men pressed close to the steps, collars turned up, breath steaming in the cold. Women clustered behind them, shawls pulled tight, eyes sharp. Boys darted at the edges, pretending they weren't interested and failing. A few respectable faces tried to look disgusted while still leaning in. Someone sold oranges. Someone sold papers already printed with guesses. London liked to be prepared for tragedy. A woman in black passed through the crowd and people turned their heads as if pulled by a string. Not Mary Pearcey, she was inside, but the idea of her moved among them, thick as smoke. People wanted to see their villain in any bonnet's shadow. The courthouse doors swallowed the day. Mrs. Gleadle, neighbor. Mrs. Gleadle came because she told herself it was duty. She had not wanted to. She had stood at her window the night the rumors began and felt her stomach twist with the knowledge that she'd seen something and done nothing. Then she'd watched the street fill with whispers the way water filled a cracked bowl. She'd heard Phoebe's name spoken with pity and with judgment, sometimes in the same breath. She told herself going to court would make it right. That if she sat there and listened, the truth would settle into place like dust. The courtroom was warm with bodies and expectation. Mrs. Gleadle stood at the back of the gallery, lips pressed together, hands clasped so hard her knuckles hurt. She watched Mary Pearcey's profile and tried to feel certainty. That's her, she told herself. That's the one. But beneath the certainty was another thought, quieter, more poisonous. And if it isn't? She pushed it down. Doubt was indulgence. Doubt was a luxury for people whose lives did not depend on being right. A young clerk, in the gallery. The clerk beside her, barely a man, face pink with excitement, whispered to his friend, "Look at her. She doesn't even look sorry." His friend snorted softly. "They never do. That sort. Cold as stone." Mrs. Gleadle's stomach tightened. That sort. A phrase that made a person into a category. A phrase that made the world simpler than it was. Mrs. Gleadle told herself she didn't use phrases like that. But she remembered the way she'd watched Phoebe walk beside Mary and thought, that one'll ruin her. She swallowed hard. Mr. Kettleby, pawnbroker. Mr. Kettleby didn't attend the court. He didn't have time for it. Time was money and he had a shop to run. But he read the papers with a quick, satisfied interest, as if the tragedy confirmed something he'd always known about women, that they were trouble when left to themselves. He enjoyed his breakfast more as he read. He enjoyed the neatness of a story where guilt had a face. When Etta mentioned Phoebe's name, he grunted. Should have kept her man on a tighter leash, he said, and felt righteous. He never noticed Etta's face harden as she turned away to tie a parcel with shaking fingers. Etta, pawnbroker's girl. Etta read the report twice. She kept seeing Phoebe's hand hovering over the pen, the cross on the page like a bruise. She kept hearing Mary Pearcey's voice, confident, calm, as if calmness were proof of guilt. Etta tried to imagine herself in that room with a baby in her arms and a rival beside her. Tried to imagine what it felt like to be trapped between shame and survival. Her stomach twisted. In the shop, she watched women bring in rings, shawls, boots, tiny silver objects from before. She watched them trade pieces of their lives for coins. She began to wonder how many crimes the city committed without ever seeing a doc. Constable Weller. Weller stood at the back of the courtroom, uniform stiff, jaw clenched. He listened to the verdict as if it were a blow he'd been bracing for. He watched Mary Pearcey's face for a crack. There was none. Guilty. The word landed and the room exhaled. People shifted as if relieved the story had found its ending. Weller felt only a hollow coldness. He thought of his own report, the pram, the late hour, the woman's eyes. He thought of how he'd stepped back instead of forward. He told himself he'd been cautious. He told himself it wasn't his place. He wondered, with a sick kind of clarity, whether caution was just another word for cowardice. Mrs. Wintle, landlady. Mrs. Wintle didn't go. She couldn't. She stayed in her kitchen, hands in water that had gone cold, scrubbing a pot that was already clean. She kept scrubbing because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. The baby was gone now. Phoebe's mother had taken him, thank God, out of London's mouth. The quiet in the house felt wrong without the child's cries. Wrong and guilty. When a neighbor came in breathless with the news, Mrs. Wintle didn't look up. They found her guilty, the neighbor said, triumphant. They'll hang her. Mrs. Wintle swallowed. Aye, she said, voice flat. Serves her right, the neighbor added, hungry for agreement. Mrs. Wintle's mouth tightened. Serves who right? She asked quietly. The neighbor blinked. The murderess. Mrs. Wintle stared into the water. She saw in her mind, Phoebe's room with its skewed tablecloth, the baby's thin cries, the smear on the banister that had stained her rag. She thought of Frank Hogg walking free. She said, because if she said more she might say something that would split her open. Edwin Sloane, reporter. Sloane wrote the headline before the judge finished speaking. He wrote with a kind of fever, his pencil moving like a sewing machine. Jealous rival condemned. A young wife's tragic end. The woman who would not let go. He did not pause to taste the cruelty of his own phrasing. Cruelty sold. Cruelty was efficient. By the time the crowd began to spill out of the courthouse, his copy was already on its way to the presses. He stood at the door and watched the faces. Triumph, disgust, satisfaction, the particular excitement of people who had witnessed a hanging in advance. Sloane felt, briefly, a strange emptiness. The story was done. The machine had eaten and was already hungry for the next thing. He pushed the emptiness away and lit a cigarette. Phoebe's mother. Mrs. Stiles heard the verdict in a rented room far from the court, holding her grandson as he slept. She had sworn she would not read the papers, but the landlord's wife had brought one in anyway, unable to resist the thrill of delivering news. They found her guilty, the woman said, eyes bright. Hanged, likely. Mrs. Stiles looked at the baby's face, smooth, innocent, unaware, and felt the verdict wash over her like cold rain. Guilty. It did not bring Phoebe back. It did not warm the baby's bed. It did not answer the question that haunted her at night: why was my daughter alone? Mrs. Stiles folded the paper carefully, as if neatness could contain rage. She placed it under the lamp and watched the inked words sit there, big, confident, final. She wanted to tear it. Instead she whispered to the sleeping child, "You will know her name," and the promise tasted like iron. Not like they print it. Like she was. Mary Pearcey, a final glimpse. As Mary was led away, the crowd outside surged. Someone shouted an insult. Someone threw a peal. Someone laughed. Mary lifted her chin. For the briefest moment, her gaze swept across the faces, and there was something in it that made even the loudest mouths quiet. Not remorse. Not fear. A kind of terrible understanding, that the city had decided what it wanted from her, and now it would take it. Then she was gone, swallowed by doors and corridors and the machinery of punishment. London, the last voice. That night, in kitchens and parlors and public houses, people retold the day. They said the woman was cold. They said the wife was pure. They said the child was a mercy. They said the law was right. They slept better for having a villain. And in the quiet between the retellings, Phoebe Hogg, Phoebe the girl, Phoebe the woman, Phoebe the mother, became what London always made of the dead. A story that belonged to everyone, and therefore to no one at all. Epilogue, the exhibit. The first time Edwin Sloane saw the pram again, it wasn't in the street. It was under lights. He stood in a room that smelled faintly of wax and polish, the air warmer than it ought to be, the silence padded by velvet. The place was meant to feel respectable, education masquerading as entertainment, but Sloane had made a living long enough to recognize a crowd's appetite in any outfit. Madame Tussauds. He had come on a whim and told himself it was professional curiosity. He told himself he wanted to see what the public was paying for now that the trial was done and the gallows had done their work. He told himself he was looking for the next story. He did not tell himself the truth, that the case had not left him, and he wanted proof that it had ended. Proof you could stand beside and point at and say there. Finished. The attendant led him down a corridor lined with famous faces, statesmen and murderers rendered in the same smooth wax, the same frozen composure. Sloane watched people drift past the figures, laughing softly, whispering, leaning close. He saw what he had helped create. Then he saw the pram. It stood behind a low barrier like a relic behind an altar rail. The perambulator's hood was raised. The fabric looked cleaner than it had in the street, but no amount of cleaning could erase the wrongness that clung to it. The wheels were still caked with a faint residue of dried mud. One side bore a stain, dark, uneven, that the gaslight could not soften. A card was placed near the wheels, neatly printed, giving the pram a name as if naming made it safe. It spoke of sensational crime and notorious jealousy and the public's fascination, the words trimmed and polite. Sloane read the card twice. It did not mention Phoebe's hands. It did not mention the baby's cry. It did not mention the texture of fear, the way it lived in stairwells and door bolts and the space between a question and an answer. It mentioned Mary Pearcey. It mentioned spectacle. Sloane's mouth went dry. He glanced around the room. Couples moved slowly, as if strolling in a gallery. Boys pointed and laughed and were shushed without conviction. Women stared at the pram with a particular expression, a mix of horror and relief, as if the exhibit confirmed something comforting. It wasn't me. That was what the city always wanted from a tragedy. Proof that it belonged to someone else. Sloane stepped closer until the barrier brushed his coat. He imagined suddenly the moment in the street, The pram's wheels skittering on wet stone, the hood too still, the woman pushing as if chased by her own thoughts. He imagined the coppery smell, the panic in the air. He had not been there. He had only written about it. But writing had made it real enough to haunt him. A woman beside him pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. Her friend leaned in and whispered something, delighted. A man chuckled as if it were a clever prop. Sloane's stomach tightened. The pram had become an object now. A thing. Not a tool of desperation. Not a piece of evidence. Not a burden pushed through wet streets by a woman whose face no one could agree on. An exhibit. He took out his notebook without thinking. His fingers found the pencil stub in his pocket. Habit. Always habit. He stared at the blank page. What would he write? He could write an article about the display. About the public's morbid curiosity. About the museum's taste. It would be clever. It would be safe. It would be read. But as he stood there, something rose in him, unfamiliar, unwelcome. Not guilt exactly. A kind of shame. Because he remembered suddenly and sharply, the baby's face in Mrs. Wintle's arms at the station, flushed, damp with tears, mouth open in a cry that didn't belong in print. He remembered how Mrs. Wintle had looked at him as if he were vermin and prophet both. He remembered Phoebe's name leaving her lips like a wound. Phoebe Hogg. Sloane stared at the pram again. Behind it, the room's lights made everything glossy. People smiled beside horrors the way they smiled beside monuments. He imagined Phoebe's mother, Mrs. Stiles, walking into this room and seeing the object that had carried her daughter's end treated like a curiosity. He imagined her hands tightening around her grandson. He imagined her rage. Sloane's pencil hovered. He did not write. He put the notebook away as if it had betrayed him. In the corridor outside, the museum's other exhibits waited. Masks, weapons, figures of famous killers frozen mid-infamy. The city's nightmares rendered entertaining. Sloane walked out into the street feeling oddly hollow. Outside, London was London. Carts rattled. Men shouted. Women carried baskets. Babies cried and were soothed and carried on. Life continued the way it always did, relentless, indifferent, loud. As he passed a young mother near the curb, her baby bundled against her chest, Sloane saw her glance down with a tenderness so simple it almost broke him. She adjusted the blanket, kissed the child's forehead, and kept walking. Sloane stopped for half a heartbeat, watching. Then he turned away, because he had work and because men like him always turned away from the parts of a story that couldn't be sold. But the image followed him, a mother and her baby moving through the damp light, fragile and alive. And somewhere far from London, in a quieter house where the air did not smell of coal, a child would grow up with a name that did not belong to headlines. Mrs. Stiles would say again and again, "Your mother was Phoebe." Not the deceased. Not the victim. Not the young wife. Phoebe. A person. A woman who laid a tablecloth straight and made weak tea and rocked her baby in the grey light. A woman who deserved more than an exhibit. The city would keep its pram behind glass. But in one small home, in one stubborn voice, Phoebe's life would stay where it belonged. In the telling that refused to turn her into a lesson. Bibliography. Primary sources. The Proceedings of the Old Bailey. Mary Pearcey, Trial Record, Central Criminal Court. Old Bailey Proceedings Online, Record T18901124-43. British Newspaper Archive. Search results for Mary Pearcey, 309 plus articles, filter by October, Dec 1890 for discovery, inquest, trial and execution coverage. National Archives, Discovery Catalogue. Illustrated broadside of execution of Mrs. Pearcey for the Hampstead murders, printed by H.P. Such, held by Surrey History Centre. Trove, National Library of Australia. Newspaper coverage, trial and execution of Mrs. Pearcey. Material culture and museum documentation. Madame Tussauds London, Archive. Chamber of Horrors artifacts, Mary Pearcey's pram, provenance note, purchased from Frank Hogg for £25 after police returned it. Modern secondary sources. Hopton, Sarah Beth. Woman at the Devil's Door, The Untold True Story of the Hampstead Murderess. 2018.